The water was rising fast, swallowing Main Street whole, and Beau Callahan was the only man fool enough to ride straight into it. Children screamed from second-story windows. Men who'd spit at his boots just yesterday now begged for his help. Rose watched from the hill, her heart hammering against her ribs as the current grabbed his horse's legs. This was the man the town called a monster, the man they'd warned her about with whispered threats and sideways glances, and he was about to die saving people who'd never shown him an ounce of mercy. If you want to know how we got here, how a discarded woman and a haunted cowboy defied an entire town, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Copper Creek trading post, sending up a cloud of red dust that coated everything in a fine, choking layer. Rose Whitmore stepped down onto soil that felt as unforgiving as the journey that had brought her here. 23 days of bone-rattling travel, stale bread, and sleepless nights had reduced her green traveling dress to something resembling a rag. Her auburn hair, once carefully pinned in the fashion she'd seen in the Boston ladies' magazines, now hung in limp strands around her pale face. She stood there with her single carpetbag clutched in white-knuckled hands, scanning the handful of weathered buildings that made up the town's commercial center. A saloon with peeling paint, a general store with a crooked sign, a blacksmith shop belching smoke into the crystalline September sky. And everywhere, the red dirt, on the buildings, on the hitching posts, on the boots of every man who passed without looking at her. "This is Copper Creek, miss," the driver said, already hauling luggage down for the other passengers. "End of the line." End of the line. The words echoed in Rose's mind with terrible finality. She'd traveled nearly 2,000 miles based on letters filled with promises. Promises of marriage, of a new life, of a home waiting for her in the West. Jonathan Mercer had written such beautiful words. He'd described Copper Creek as a growing town, full of opportunity and civilization. He told her about the house he was building, the land he'd claimed, the future they would share. All lies. She'd discovered the truth 3 hours ago when the stagecoach had stopped in Silver Ridge, the last town before Copper Creek. A woman at the way station had recognized Jonathan's name immediately. Mercer? That snake left 2 weeks back with every penny he could charm out of foolish women. You're the third one to come looking for him this month, honey. He's probably in California by now, spending your money on cards and whiskey. The other passengers had moved on, claimed by waiting families or heading into the saloon. The driver tipped his hat and climbed back onto his seat. "Good luck to you, miss." The stagecoach rolled away, leaving Rose alone in the street. She squared her shoulders and walked toward the general store. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, leather, and something vaguely medicinal. A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from behind the counter, his expression shifting from curiosity to guarded neutrality when he took in her worn appearance. "Help you, miss?" "I'm looking for work," Rose said, hating the tremor in her voice. "I can keep books, do sewing, teach children. Don't need any of that." The man's tone was clipped, final. "Try the boarding house down the street. Maybe Mrs. Patterson needs kitchen help." Mrs. Patterson, a severe woman with iron-gray hair and a mouth that looked like it had never smiled, barely let Rose finish her introduction. "I run a respectable establishment. I don't hire women who arrive alone on the stage with no references and no husband." Her eyes raked over Rose's disheveled appearance. "Particularly ones who look like they've been traveling hard and living rough. People talk, you understand." "I have references," Rose protested, reaching into her bag for the letters she'd brought from Boston, recommendations from the families she'd worked for as a governess. "I'm educated. I'm sure you can do many things, dear." Mrs. Patterson's voice dripped with false sweetness and real disdain. "But not in my establishment. Good day." The door closed with a decisive click. Rose stood on the boardwalk, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. Not here. Not where people could see. She walked quickly toward the edge of town, past the last of the buildings, until she found herself on a dirt path that led toward the hills. The September sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Rose had any capacity left to appreciate beauty. She sank down on a fallen log near a creek, finally allowing herself to cry. Great gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest. She'd spent the last of her money on the stagecoach ticket. She had perhaps $2 in coins left, enough for maybe 2 meals if she was careful. No job, no prospects, no place to sleep tonight. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up sharply. A rider approached on a massive dun-colored horse, silhouetted against the setting sun. As he drew closer, Rose's breath caught. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a way of sitting in the saddle that spoke of countless hours riding. Dark hair fell to his collar beneath a battered black hat. But it was his face that struck her. Hard lines, a jaw dark with stubble, and eyes that seemed to look straight through her. He couldn't have been much past 30, but he carried himself like a man who'd lived several lifetimes, all of them hard. He reined in his horse a few yards away, those piercing eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to shrink into herself. "You're on my land," he said. His voice was deep, rough, like gravel underfoot. Rose scrambled to her feet, brushing at her tear-stained face. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I'll leave." He dismounted with fluid grace, ground-tying his horse. Up close, he was even more imposing, easily 6 feet tall, with the lean, hard build of a man who worked with his hands. There was a coiled tension about him, like a wolf deciding whether you were prey or just an annoyance. "You're the woman who came in on today's stage." It wasn't a question. Looking for Jonathan Mercer. Fresh humiliation burned through Rose's chest. News travels fast. "Small town." He pulled a canteen from his saddle and offered it to her. When she hesitated, something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "It's just water. You look like you need it." She took it, suddenly aware of how parched she was. The water was cool and clean, better than anything she'd tasted since leaving the last way station. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." Bo Callahan. The name meant nothing to her, but she saw the way his jaw tightened as he said it, as if expecting a reaction. "I'm Rose Whitmore." "I know." He took the canteen back, his fingers careful not to touch hers. "You tried the store. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Probably the saloon, too." They all said no. Rose felt the tears threatening again and fought them back. She wouldn't cry in front of this stranger, this man whose mere presence seemed to fill all the available space. "I don't suppose you know of anyone who needs help. I can cook, clean, keep accounts. I was a governess in Boston." Boston. He said it like it was a foreign country, which she supposed it was in a way. "Long way from home." "I don't have a home." The words came out more bitter than she intended. "I thought I did. I thought I was coming here to be married." Bo's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. "Mercer's a con man. Been running that scheme up and down the territory for 2 years. You're not the first." "So I've been told." Rose looked down at her hands, at the calluses forming from gripping the carpetbag for hundreds of miles. "I don't suppose that helps me much now." Silence stretched between them. A hawk cried out overhead. The creek burbled over smooth stones. Rose could feel Bo watching her, could almost hear him thinking, weighing something in his mind. "I might have work," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him something. "My mother passed 3 months back. House needs keeping. I'm not much for cooking or cleaning. I can pay room and board, a small wage." Rose's head snapped up. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a roof and food in exchange for work." His tone was careful, deliberate. "Nothing more. There's a spare room. You'd have privacy. I spend most days working the ranch. Don't get back until sundown. You'd be alone most of the time." It should have sounded like salvation. Instead, warning bells rang in Rose's mind. A strange man, a remote cabin, a woman alone. She'd heard enough cautionary tales to fill a library, but what choice did she have? Sleep in the street? Starve? "Why would you help me?" she asked, searching his face for any sign of deception. "You don't know me." Bo's laugh was short and humorless. "I know what it's like to have the whole town decide you're not worth their time. I know what it's like to need help and have every door slam in your face." He moved back toward his horse, gathering the reins. "But if you'd rather take your chances in town, that's your choice. I won't press it." "Wait." The word escaped before Rose could think better of it. "This job, what exactly would you expect? Cooking, cleaning, maybe some mending? My mother kept chickens, a garden. They'll need tending if you're willing. He swung up into the saddle with easy strength. House is about 5 miles north of here, up in the hills. I leave at dawn, usually back by supper. You do your work, I do mine. We stay out of each other's way. And that's all? Rose hated the skepticism in her voice, but she had to know. You're not expecting anything else? Something dark flashed across Beau's face. Anger, maybe, or hurt. I'm not Mercer. I don't make promises I can't keep, and I don't want anything from you except an honest day's work. He looked down at her from horseback, his expression unreadable. You'll have a lock on your door, my word on that. Rose realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that she believed him. There was something fundamentally honest about Beau Callahan, something in the direct way he looked at her, the careful way he held himself apart. He wasn't trying to charm her or win her over. He was offering a transaction, plain and simple. All right, she said before she could lose her nerve. I'll take the job. Beau dismounted again and retrieved her carpet bag before she could protest. You can ride with me. Horse can handle double for 5 miles. The ride up into the hills was the most physically uncomfortable and strangely peaceful experience of Rose's life. She sat behind Beau in the saddle, forced to hold onto his waist to keep her balance. He was solid as oak beneath her hands, warm despite the cooling evening air. He didn't speak, and neither did she. The horse moved with a smooth, ground-eating gait that covered distance faster than Rose had expected. As they climbed higher, the landscape changed. The red dirt gave way to rocky soil dotted with scrub pine and juniper. The air grew cooler, scented with sage and something sharp and clean. When they crested a ridge, Rose gasped. The cabin sat in a small valley, protected on 3 sides by rising hills. It was larger than she'd expected, a solid log structure with a stone chimney, a covered porch, and several outbuildings. A split-rail fence enclosed a kitchen garden, and beyond it, she could see a chicken coop and what looked like a small barn. The last light of day gilded everything in gold, making the rough cabin look almost beautiful. It's not fancy, Beau said, his first word since they'd left town. But it's solid. Roof doesn't leak. Stove draws clean. He helped her down from the horse with impersonal efficiency, his hands on her waist for only the second it took to steady her feet on the ground. Then he was moving away, leading the horse toward the barn, leaving Rose standing alone in the yard. She picked up her carpet bag and walked to the cabin. The door was unlocked. In itself, a statement about how remote this place was. Inside, she found a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with carefully labeled jars and cans. 2 doors led off the main room. Beau appeared in the doorway, his arms full of firewood. Left door's yours, right one's mine. There's a spring house out back for the milk and butter. Well's just past the garden. He stacked the wood near the fireplace with practiced movements. You hungry? Rose realized she was starving. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal. Yes. There's bacon, eggs, some bread my mother made before. He trailed off, his face tightening. Before. I can fry something up. Let me. Rose set down her bag, suddenly eager to prove her worth. You've been working all day. I'll cook. She expected him to argue, but he just nodded and moved toward the door marked as his. I'll wash up. Left alone, Rose explored the kitchen area with growing relief. It was well-stocked, clean, organized. The stove was a good one, better than what she'd had in Boston. She found the bacon hanging in the spring house, the eggs in the coop, the bread in a tin box that kept it fresh. By the time Beau emerged, his face scrubbed clean, his hair damp, she had bacon sizzling in the pan and eggs ready to crack. They ate in silence at the rough table. Rose kept stealing glances at her enigmatic employer, trying to understand him. He ate methodically, without apparent enjoyment, like it was just fuel. His hands were scarred, the knuckles thickened from old breaks. A thin white line ran along his left jaw, disappearing into his collar. You said people in town decided I wasn't worth their time, Rose said finally, unable to stand the silence any longer. Why? Beau looked up from his plate, his dark eyes unreadable. Because I said so. What? I said, why would they treat me that way? Not you. He pushed his empty plate aside. But since you're asking, I killed a man 2 years ago. They don't forget that kind of thing. Rose's hand stilled on her fork. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but something in Beau's face stopped her. There was no pride there, no threat, just a flat, factual statement. Did you have a reason? She heard herself ask. He was beating his wife to death in the street. I tried to pull him off. He went for his gun. Beau's voice was monotone, distant. I was faster. That's not murder. That's self-defense. That's what the marshal said. Even ruled it justified. Beau stood, gathering the plates. Doesn't matter to the town. They see what they want to see. And what they see when they look at me is someone who takes life too easy. He moved to the wash basin, his back to her. Rose watched the tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his movements. The man you killed, was he from Copper Creek? Tom Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's son. Understanding crashed over Rose like a wave. The boarding house owner's hostility, the way people in town had looked at her when she mentioned Beau's name, or rather, the way they carefully didn't look. His wife? Rose asked quietly. Sarah. She left town after. Went back to her family in Kansas. Beau's hands stilled in the wash water. Can't say I blame her. This place has too many ghosts. And you stayed. This is my land. My mother's buried on that hill. He nodded toward the window where Rose could just make out a fenced plot in the fading light. I'm not running because people don't like the truth of what happened. Rose stood and moved to help with the dishes. Beau looked surprised, but didn't stop her when she took a towel and began drying. Thank you, she said, for being honest with me, for giving me a chance when no one else would. Don't thank me yet, Beau handed her another plate. Winter comes hard up here. Work's not easy. You might decide it's not worth it. I don't have anywhere else to go, Rose said simply, so I'll make it worth it. For the first time, something that might have been respect flickered in Beau's eyes. We'll see. That night, Rose lay in the narrow bed in her new room, clean sheets, a warm quilt, a lock on the door just as Beau had promised, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier, wind in the pines, an owl calling, the creak of the cabin settling, and underneath it all, the quiet movements of the man in the next room, the stranger who'd shown her more kindness in one evening than an entire town had managed in a day. She'd traveled 2,000 miles for a lie. But maybe, just maybe, she'd found something real at the end of the journey. The first week passed in a blur of exhausting work and cautious coexistence. Rose woke with the sun and discovered that keeping house on a frontier ranch meant something entirely different than it had in Boston. The chickens needed feeding and their eggs collected. The garden needed weeding and watering. Floors needed sweeping, constantly, because the red dirt seemed to seep in through every crack. Meals needed planning and cooking for a man who could put away more food than Rose had thought possible. Beau was true to his word. He left before sunrise and returned at sunset, often covered in dirt and sweat, his clothes torn from working with barbed wire or wrestling stubborn cattle. He spoke little, ate what she put in front of him without comment, and disappeared into his room as soon as the dishes were done. But Rose noticed things, the way he always filled the wood box before he left, so she wouldn't have to carry logs herself, the way he'd repaired the broken step on the spring house without being asked, the way he carefully avoided moving too fast around her, as if aware that his size and strength might be intimidating. On the 8th day, Rose was beating rugs on the porch line when she heard horses approaching. 3 riders crested the ridge, moving with the careless confidence of men who owned the world. Beau was somewhere on the back 40, checking fence lines. Rose set down her beater and waited, shielding her eyes against the morning sun. The lead rider was a younger man, maybe 25, with sandy hair and an expensive saddle. His companions were rougher types, hired hands by the look of them. Well now, the young man said, his eyes raking over Rose in a way that made her skin crawl. Beau's got himself some company. Didn't know the hermit had it in him. Can I help you with something? Rose kept her voice level, professional. I'm Wade Harrington. My father owns the H-Bar Ranch, biggest spread in the territory. He swung down from his horse with practiced ease. We're looking for some cattle that wandered onto Callahan's land. Thought we'd collect them, seeing as we're neighborly and all. There was nothing neighborly in his tone, Rose had been around enough men to recognize the underlying threat. Mr. Callahan isn't here right now. Perhaps you could come back. Oh, we won't wait for Bo. Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. Man's not exactly the social type anyway. We'll just gather our stock and be on our way. I don't think... You don't need to think, darling. That's what the men are for. Wade tipped his hat in a gesture that was more mockery than courtesy. He nodded to his companions, and they began riding toward the north pasture. Rose stood on the porch, her heart hammering. Something was wrong. The casual disrespect, the way Wade had emphasized our stock, the sneering way he dismissed Bo. She looked toward the barn, where Bo's spare horse stood in the corral, then made a decision that was probably foolish, but felt necessary. 10 minutes later, she was riding bareback, not something she'd done since childhood, and never on a horse this large, toward the north pasture. Her skirts were hiked up unladylike around her knees. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and she was fairly certain she'd fall off at any moment. But she could see the riders ahead, and she could see something else. They weren't just gathering cattle. They were cutting Bo's fence. "Stop!" Rose called out, her voice embarrassingly breathless from the rough ride. "That's not your fence to cut." Wade turned, genuine surprise on his face that she'd followed. Then he laughed. "Well, look at that. Boston's got some fire in her after all." He gestured to the fence. "This fence is on my father's land. Has been for years. Bo just keeps building it back in the wrong place." "That's a lie." The words were out before Rose could stop them. "I've seen the survey maps in the house. This is Mr. Callahan's property, clear as day." One of Wade's companions spoke up, his voice ugly. "Maps can be wrong. And anyway, what's Bo going to do about it? He already killed one man. Town won't look kindly on him making it two." The threat hung in the air like a physical thing. Rose felt fear crawl up her spine, but she held her ground. "You should leave, now." "Or what?" Wade moved his horse closer, crowding her mount. "You'll tell Bo? He already knows we're taking what's ours. Why do you think he stays scarce when we ride through?" He leaned forward in his saddle. "Let me give you some advice, sweetheart. Bo Callahan is a killer and an outcast. Whatever he's paying you, whatever he's promised, it's not worth tying your reputation to his. You're new here. You could still make a decent life in town if you cut ties now." "I'm not interested in your advice." "No." Wade's expression hardened. "Then here's not advice, it's a warning. My father owns half this county. The other half answers to him. Bo's been a thorn in his side for too long, and you're making yourself a problem by association. Smart women know when to step aside." "Then I suppose I'm not very smart." Wade studied her for a long moment, something calculating in his eyes. Then he laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "Suit yourself. But don't say you weren't warned when things get difficult." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his companions following. They left the cut fence behind them like a calling card. Rose sat on the horse, shaking with reaction, until she heard another rider approaching. Bo appeared over the ridge, moving fast, his face dark as a thundercloud. He reined in next to her, his eyes sweeping over her, checking for injury, she realized. "You all right?" "I'm fine. They cut your fence, took some cattle, said it was their land." "It's not." Bo's voice was flat, controlled, but Rose could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "Harrington's been trying to push me off this land for 2 years. Started right after..." He trailed off, but Rose knew he meant right after he'd killed Tom Patterson. "Figures I'm an easy target. Man everyone already hates." "What are you going to do?" Bo looked at the cut fence, then back at Rose. "Fix the fence. Keep my head down. Same as always." "That's it?" Rose couldn't keep the disbelief out of her voice. "They just steal from you and you do nothing?" "What would you have me do?" Bo's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw real emotion there, a deep, bone-weary frustration. "Ride to the marshal? Harrington owns him. Go to court? With what money? Start a fight? They'd love that. Give them an excuse to run me off for good, maybe put me in the ground next to my mother." He gathered his reins. "I choose my battles, Rose, and this isn't one I can win." "So you just let them take whatever they want?" "I survive." Bo's voice was hard. "That's all any of us can do. You'd do well to remember that." He rode off toward the cut fence, leaving Rose alone with her churning thoughts. She'd been raised on stories of heroes who stood up to injustice, who fought back against wrong. But here, in the harsh reality of the frontier, heroism looked different. It looked like a man fixing the same fence over and over, swallowing his pride, enduring the slow theft of everything he'd worked for, because the alternative was death. That night, Rose made Beau's favorite meal, beef stew with fresh bread and dried apple pie. It was a small thing, an inadequate thing, but it was all she had to offer. When he came in for supper, he stopped in the doorway, taking in the carefully set table, the smell of home cooking. "You didn't have to, I know." Rose filled his plate, piled it high. "But I wanted to. You gave me a chance when I had nothing. I'm not going to let Wade Harrington convince me to abandon that." Beau sat slowly, as if the chair might break beneath him. "He threatened you?" "He warned me. There's a difference." Rose took her own seat. "I don't scare easy, Mr. Callahan." "Beau? What?" "Call me Beau. Seems silly to stand on formality when you're living in my house and riding my horses bareback through the hills like a wild woman." Despite everything, Rose felt herself smile. "I must have looked ridiculous." "You looked brave." Beau's eyes met hers across the table. "Foolish, maybe, but brave." They ate in companionable silence, and Rose realized something had shifted between them. They weren't just employer and employee anymore. They were allies. Two people the world had decided weren't worth its time, making their own small stand against loneliness and injustice. After dinner, as Rose washed dishes and Beau dried, a routine they'd fallen into without discussing, he spoke again. "My mother used to say that the measure of a person isn't in how they act when times are good. It's how they act when the whole world's against them." He hung up the towel with careful precision. "She'd have liked you, I think." It was perhaps the longest speech Rose had heard from him, and she treasured it like a gift. "I wish I could have known her. She was tough. Had to be, raising a son alone out here after my father died." Beau stared out the window at the darkening hills. "She taught me to read, to do sums, to judge livestock. Taught me that a man's word is his bond, and that honest work is its own reward." His voice roughened. "Don't know that I've lived up to her teaching, but I try. You gave me honest work when everyone else turned me away. You've kept your word about everything, the room, the lock, the wages." Rose dried her hands and turned to face him. "I'd say you're living up to it just fine." Beau looked at her then, really looked at her, and Rose saw something vulnerable in his face, a longing for connection, for someone to see him as more than the man who killed Tom Patterson. Then he shuttered it away, retreating behind his usual reserve. "Best get some rest. Tomorrow's Sunday. We can take a break from the heavy work, but the animals still need tending." "Beau?" Rose called as he headed toward his room. "Thank you, for today, for standing up to Wade." "I didn't stand up to him. I let him cut my fence and steal my cattle." "No. You chose not to get yourself killed in a fight you couldn't win. That's not weakness. That's wisdom." Beau paused in his doorway, his back to her. "Sometimes I'm not sure there's a difference." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Rose stood alone in the main room, listening to the fire crackle and the wind pick up outside. Tomorrow was Sunday, the day the town would gather for church and socializing. She and Beau would be up here in the hills, tending chickens and mending fences, outsiders by choice and circumstance. And somehow, that felt exactly right. The weeks rolled by in a rhythm that became familiar, almost comfortable. Rose learned the language of the land, how to read the sky for coming weather, how to tell when the well water was running low, how to coax vegetables from the stubborn soil. Her hands, soft from years of indoor work in Boston, developed calluses and strength. Her skin, once carefully protected from the sun, bronzed despite her best efforts with the bonnet. And slowly, carefully, she and Beau learned each other. She discovered he couldn't carry a tune worth a damn, but loved when she sang while working in the kitchen. That he had a dry wit that emerged only when he was truly relaxed. That he read voraciously, his mother's books lined a shelf in his room, everything from Shakespeare to agricultural manuals. And sometimes, in the evening, he'd read aloud while Rose mended or knitted. He discovered she had a talent for numbers and reorganized his account books into a system that actually made sense. That she was stubborn as a mule when she thought she was right. That she had nightmares sometimes. He'd heard her crying out in her sleep and learned to light a lamp in the main room, a small beacon in case she needed it. They didn't talk about the growing connection between them, didn't acknowledge the way their hands sometimes brushed when passing dishes, the way their eyes met across the table and held a moment too long. It was too fragile, too new, and both of them had been hurt too badly to trust easy affection. But it was there, growing like Rose's garden, quiet, persistent, and surprisingly strong. October arrived with crisp mornings and the smell of autumn in the air. Rose was hanging laundry when she heard the thunder of hooves and looked up to see a rider coming fast from town. Her heart sank when she recognized him, Deputy Marshal Frank Crawford, a red-faced man who barely concealed his contempt for Bo. Bo emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. "Frank, Bo." Crawford didn't dismount. "Town meeting tonight. Required attendance." "Required?" Bo's voice was carefully neutral. "Since when?" "Since the Harringtons decided we need to talk about water rights and grazing boundaries. Everyone's expected to be there. That includes you." "And if I don't come?" Crawford's smile was ugly. "Then the town makes decisions about your land without your input. Your choice." He rode off before Bo could respond. Rose walked over, her arms full of wet sheets. "It's a trap." "Probably." Bo watched the deputy disappear over the ridge. "But he's right. If I don't show up, they'll carve up my land and call it legal." He turned to her, his expression grim. "I need to go into town tonight. You should stay here." "Absolutely not." Rose dumped the sheets in the basket. "If you're walking into trouble, you're not doing it alone." "Rose?" "No." She faced him squarely, hands on her hips. "I'm coming. And before you argue, remember that I'm the one who organized your books and found the survey maps that prove your property lines. If they're going to debate water rights, you'll want someone there who actually knows where your water rights are." Bo stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head with something that might have been admiration. "You're a stubborn woman, Rose Whitmore." "I know." She picked up the laundry basket. "We should leave early. I want to dress properly. If I'm going to face down the town that rejected me, I'm going to do it looking respectable." That evening, Rose put on her second-best dress, a dark blue wool that had survived the journey west relatively intact, and pinned her hair into a careful knot. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw someone different from the broken woman who'd arrived 6 weeks ago. Her face had color now. Her eyes had purpose. She looked like she belonged somewhere. Bo emerged from his room in clean clothes, his face freshly shaved, his dark hair combed back. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Bo cleared his throat and offered his arm. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be." The ride to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Copper Creek, Rose could see lights blazing in the church, the largest building in town and the only one big enough for a gathering. Horses crowded the hitching posts. The whole town had turned out. They tied their horse at the edge of the crowd and walked toward the church. Conversation stopped as they approached. People stared, whispered behind their hands. Rose felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing, but she kept her head high and her hand on Bo's arm. Inside, the church was packed. The Harringtons sat in the front pew. Richard Harrington, a silver-haired man with eyes like chips of ice, and his son Wade, who smirked when he saw them enter. Mrs. Patterson was there, her face hardening at the sight of Bo. Half the merchants in town, all the ranchers, even some of the saloon girls dressed in their Sunday best. Bo led Rose to a seat in the back, and they sat in a bubble of empty space. No one wanted to sit too close to the town killer. Marshal James Hendricks called the meeting to order. He was a heavy-set man with a drinker's complexion and Harrington money in his pocket. Everyone knew it, even if no one said it. "We're here to discuss the drought situation," Hendricks began. "Creeks running lower than normal for this time of year. We need to talk about fair allocation of water rights." Richard Harrington stood, commanding the room with ease. "My concern is simple. We have several small ranchers who are taking more than their share of water from Copper Creek. The H-Bar Ranch has the largest operation, the most cattle, and we're finding our downstream access severely limited." "Because you have more cattle than the creek can support," Bo said quietly, but his voice carried in the sudden silence. Harrington's eyes narrowed. "Something to say, Callahan?" Bo stood slowly, and Rose felt the tension ratchet up in the room. Your father's operation was sustainable when my father was alive. You've doubled your herd in the last 5 years. The problem isn't small ranchers taking too much. It's big operations taking what they don't have. That's your opinion. The law might see it differently. Harrington's smile was cold, especially when we look at whose property has the best access to the creek source. Understanding hit Rose like a fist. This wasn't about water conservation. This was about taking Bo's land, the land that sat at the headwaters of Copper Creek. My land has rights, Bo said, still calm, but with steel underneath. Water rights established when my father homesteaded here 30 years ago. Those rights are legally filed and documented. Documents can be challenged. Wade Harrington stood next to his father, especially when they're old and the surveying methods were questionable. We think a new survey would show the headwaters are actually on H-bar land. That's a lie. Rose was on her feet before she realized she'd moved. Every eye in the church turned to her. I've reviewed the original survey documents. The property lines are clear. The headwaters are on Bo Callahan's land, have been for 30 years, and no amount of wishful thinking changes that. And who are you? Richard Harrington's voice dripped with disdain. The woman who came west chasing a con man. Forgive me if I don't value your opinion on legal matters. The church erupted in whispers. Rose felt her face burn, but she didn't back down. I'm the woman who can read a legal document and do basic mathematics, which apparently makes me overqualified for this conversation. The water rights are clear. If you want to challenge them, do it in court. But stop pretending this town meeting has any legal authority over private property. She's right. A new voice spoke from the side of the church. Rose turned to see an older woman she didn't recognize standing up. Those water rights are documented at the county seat. I should know, I'm the one who filed them for Bo's father when I was working at the land office. Mrs. Chen makes a good point, another voice said, one of the smaller ranchers. We're all struggling with the drought, but stealing water rights isn't the answer. No one's talking about stealing, Harrington said smoothly, but Rose could see the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. We're talking about fair allocation. Then let's talk numbers. Rose sat down and pulled out the small notebook she'd brought. According to the creek flow measurements from the land office, Copper Creek produces approximately 1,200 gallons per minute during normal flow. The H-Bar Ranch currently runs 1,500 head of cattle. At 20 gallons per head per day, that's... This isn't a mathematics lesson, Wade interrupted. No, it's an education in how your ranch uses more water than the creek can support, and instead of reducing your herd to sustainable levels, you're trying to force everyone else to give up their legal rights. Rose met his eyes squarely. The problem isn't Bo Callahan's land, it's your father's greed. The church went dead silent. No one, absolutely no one, talked to Richard Harrington like that. Harrington's face went red, then white. You have some nerve, girl. You blow into town on the stage, take up with the first man who'll have you, and now you think you can lecture me about my business. I can read maps and do arithmetic. Apparently that's all it takes. Rose's voice was steady, but her hand shook in her lap. She felt Bo's hand cover hers under the pew, warm and solid. This meeting is about water rights, Marshal Hendricks said, but he sounded uncertain now. Miss Whitmore raises some points we should consider. She's Callahan's woman, Mrs. Patterson said sharply. Of course she's going to take his side. Probably hopes to marry into that land. My relationship with Mr. Callahan is none of your business, Rose said, even as her heart hammered. But the water rights are a matter of public record. If you want to challenge them, file a suit. Otherwise, stop wasting everyone's time with illegal land grabs disguised as town meetings. Richard Harrington looked at Marshal Hendricks. Are you going to allow her to speak to me this way? Hendricks shifted uncomfortably. She's got a right to speak. This is a public meeting. Fine. Harrington stood abruptly. We'll settle this the legal way. Expect a lawsuit, Callahan, and when we're done, you won't have a drop of water left to your name or a leg to stand on. He stormed out, Wade following. The meeting dissolved into chaos, people arguing, some supporting Bo, others siding with the Harringtons. Bo stood and pulled Rose to her feet. We should go. They made it outside before Rose started shaking. Bo led her away from the crowd to the dark space behind the church. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have spoken up like that. I made it worse." "You stood up for what was right." Bo's hands were on her shoulders, steadying her. "You proved the case in front of witnesses. You made Harrington show his hand." His voice roughened. "No one's ever done that for me before." Rose looked up at him in the darkness, seeing him only in outline, broad shoulders, strong jaw, eyes that held a lifetime of hurt and hope warring together. "They'll make you pay for it. Let them try." Bo's thumb brushed against her cheek, a feather-light touch. "I'm tired of running, Rose. Tired of keeping my head down and hoping they'll leave me alone. They're never going to leave me alone. So maybe it's time to fight back. That's what got you in trouble before." "No." Bo's voice was firm. "What got me in trouble before was standing up for someone who couldn't defend themselves. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. The only difference now is—" He trailed off. "Is what?" Rose whispered. "Now I have something worth fighting for." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. Then hoofbeats sounded nearby, and they pulled apart. Wade Harrington rode past, slow and deliberate, his eyes finding them in the shadows. "Better watch yourself, Callahan," he called out. "Accidents happen on remote ranches. Be a shame if something happened to your pretty little defender." He rode off, leaving the threat hanging in the air. Bo's face went hard as stone. "Get on the horse. We're leaving. Now!" They rode through the dark in tense silence. Rose could feel the coiled tension in Bo's body, the barely controlled rage. When they reached the cabin, he helped her down and immediately began checking the barn, the spring house, the chicken coop, making sure nothing had been tampered with. Rose went inside and lit lamps with shaking hands. She'd defended Bo, yes, but she'd also painted a target on both their backs. Wade's threat had been clear. The Harringtons didn't make idle threats. When Bo came in, his face was grim. "Everything looks secure, but we're going to have to be more careful. Watch for riders. Make sure the stock's accounted for every night." "Bo, I'm sorry. I should have kept quiet." "No." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her hands in his. "You stood up when no one else would. You showed that town I'm not alone, that I have someone who believes in me." His grip tightened. "You have no idea what that means to me, Rose." Looking up into his face, Rose saw the truth there. The desperate gratitude, the fierce protectiveness, and underneath it all, something deeper, something that made her breath catch. "I do believe in you," she whispered. "You're a good man, Bo Callahan. And if the whole town can't see it, that's their failing, not yours." Bo's hand came up to cup her face, his work-roughened palm gentle against her skin. For a moment, Rose thought he might kiss her. Her heart raced at the possibility, at the want she could see in his eyes. But he stepped back, releasing her. "You should get some rest. It's been a long night." Rose nodded, not trusting her voice. She retreated to her room, closed the door, and leaned against it, her heart still pounding. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming, and Rose had the feeling it would be about more than just rain. The storm Rose had sensed coming arrived 3 days later, but not in the way she'd expected. The sky remained clear, the air crisp with October promise. The real storm came in the form of a legal notice delivered by Deputy Crawford, who rode up to the cabin with barely concealed satisfaction twisting his features. "Lawsuit's been filed," he announced without preamble, thrusting the papers at Bo. "Harrington's challenging your water rights. Court date set for November 15th. You'll need a lawyer." Bo took the papers, his face unreadable. "Nearest lawyer's in Silver Ridge." "That's your problem, not mine." Crawford tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "See you in court, Callahan. Assuming you show up." He rode off, leaving Bo standing in the yard with the legal documents in his hand. Rose came down from the garden, her apron full of the last of the season's squash. She saw his expression and set the vegetables down. "How bad is it?" Bo handed her the papers without a word. Rose scanned them quickly, her heart sinking with each line. The lawsuit wasn't just challenging water rights, it was challenging the entire survey that had established Bo's property boundaries. If Harrington won, Bo wouldn't just lose access to the creek, he'd lose 1/3 of his land. "This is insane," she breathed. "These property lines have been established for 30 years. You can't just—" "You can if you have enough money and the right people in your pocket." Bo's voice was flat, defeated. The judge in Silver Ridge plays poker with Harrington every Thursday. The surveyor they've hired is the same one who redrew boundaries for the H-bar last year, conveniently adding 200 acres to their spread. Then we fight it. We get our own lawyer, our own surveyor. With what money? Bo turned away, staring out at the hills he'd called home his entire life. The lawyer alone would cost more than I make in a year. A surveyor, court fees, traveling to Silver Ridge for the hearings. He shook his head. I'm barely keeping this place afloat as it is. Rose wanted to argue, to tell him there had to be a way. But she'd seen his account books, knew exactly how thin the margin was between survival and collapse. One bad winter, one sick cow, one unexpected expense could wipe him out. A legal battle would destroy him even if he won. So what do we do? She asked quietly. We hope for a miracle. Bo's laugh was bitter. Or we start packing. That night, Rose lay awake listening to the wind and thinking furiously. There had to be something they could do, some way to fight back that didn't require money they didn't have. The original survey documents were filed at the county seat. She'd referenced them in her outburst at the town meeting. But were there copies? Other documentation that might prove Bo's case without expensive lawyers? The next morning, she found Bo in the barn, forking hay for the horses with more force than necessary. I'm going to Silver Ridge, she announced. Bo stopped mid-throw. What? The land office there has records, survey maps, property transfers, water rights documentation. If I can find copies of the original filings, we might have ammunition to fight this lawsuit. Rose had stayed up half the night planning this, and she wasn't backing down now. You can't leave the ranch. Someone needs to watch for Harrington's men. But I can go. I can search the records, maybe even find a lawyer who'll take the case for a percentage instead of upfront payment. Rose, Silver Ridge is 2 days' ride. You can't. I can, and I will. She crossed her arms. Unless you have a better idea? Bo set down the pitchfork, his expression torn between frustration and something that looked like hope. It's dangerous. Woman traveling alone? I'll take the rifle. I can shoot. My father taught me before he died. It wasn't entirely true. She'd fired a gun exactly 3 times in her life, but Bo didn't need to know that. I'll stay at respectable establishments. I'll be back in 4 days, 5 at most. If something happened to you, Bo stopped, his jaw clenching. Nothing will happen. I'm not helpless, Bo. Rose softened her voice. This is our best chance, you know it is. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll pack you supplies. And you're taking the gray mare. She's steadier than the others, won't spook easy. He moved past her, then stopped. Rose, be careful. Harrington finds out you're digging into this, he won't be happy. Let him be unhappy. I'm tired of letting bullies win. 2 hours later, Rose set out on the gray mare with saddlebags full of provisions, the rifle secured in its scabbard, and Bo's final warning ringing in her ears. She'd never made a journey like this alone, had never been responsible for navigating 2 days of open country with nothing but her wits and a compass. But as the cabin disappeared behind the ridge and the vast landscape opened before her, Rose felt something unexpected. Freedom. The first day passed without incident. She followed the trail Bo had described, stopping at a way station for the night where the proprietor, a grizzled woman who'd clearly seen everything, took one look at her and offered a room without questions. Rose paid her precious coins and slept with the rifle beside her bed, though the night remained quiet. The second day brought her into Silver Ridge just as the sun was setting. The town was larger than Copper Creek, with actual streets laid out in a grid, brick buildings, and electric lights strung along the main thoroughfare. Rose found a modest hotel, secured her horse at the livery, and collapsed into bed with her muscles screaming from the ride. Morning brought stiffness and determination in equal measure. The land office opened at 8, and Rose was waiting at the door. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a helpful demeanor, showed her to the records room without fuss. Looking for anything specific, miss? Property records for homesteads filed in Copper Creek area, 1865 to 1870, particularly anything related to the Callahan claim. That'll be in the territorial files. Fair warning, they're not well organized. Previous clerk wasn't much for systems. He gestured to rows of filing cabinets and ledger books. Help yourself. Just please put everything back where you found it. Rose spent the next 6 hours drowning in paper. Deeds, surveys, claims, counterclaims, water rights filings, boundary disputes, all of it jumbled together with no clear organization. Her eyes burned from reading faded handwriting by lamplight. Her back ached from bending over ledgers. But slowly, painstakingly, she began to piece together the story of Beau's land. The original homestead claim, filed by Thomas Callahan in 1867. The survey map clearly marking the boundaries that included the headwaters of Copper Creek, the water rights filing properly witnessed and notarized. And then, something unexpected. A dispute from 1869, where a neighboring rancher had challenged the Callahan boundaries. The challenge had been dismissed, with the judge noting that Thomas Callahan's survey was accurate and properly filed according to territorial law, with no grounds for appeal. Rose's hand shook as she copied down the case number. This was it. Legal precedent establishing that the Callahan boundaries had already survived one challenge. If she could find the court records from that case, they might have exactly what they needed. Find what you were looking for? The clerk appeared with a pot of coffee and a sympathetic smile. Maybe. Do you know where I could find court records from 1869? There was a property dispute, case number. She consulted her notes. 47-TC-1869. Courthouse basement, probably. Judge allows public access, but you'll need permission from the clerk of court. He poured her coffee without asking. You're researching the Callahan place, aren't you? Word's gotten around that Harrington's making another play for it. Rose looked up sharply. Another play? Sure. He tried to buy it after old man Callahan died, but the widow wouldn't sell. Tried again after she passed, but the son, Beau, I think, turned him down flat. Guess Harrington decided if he can't buy it, he'll take it legally. The clerk shrugged. Rich men always find a way. Not this time, Rose said with more confidence than she felt. Where's the courthouse? The clerk of court was less helpful than his land office counterpart. A pinched-faced woman with the demeanor of someone who'd never smiled in her life, she informed Rose that accessing historical court records required a written request, reviewed by the judge, with a minimum 2-week waiting period. I don't have 2 weeks. The case goes to trial November 15th. Then you should have started your research earlier. The woman turned back to her ledger, dismissing Rose entirely. Standing in the courthouse hallway, Rose felt her options narrowing. She couldn't go home empty-handed, not after Beau had trusted her with this mission. There had to be another way to access those records, something she was missing. Trouble with Mrs. Henderson? A voice spoke behind her. Rose turned to find an older gentleman in a well-cut suit, silver-haired and sharp-eyed. She's a gatekeeper by nature, enjoys the power of denying people what they need. I need court records from 1869. She says I have to wait 2 weeks. And you don't have 2 weeks. It wasn't a question. The man studied her with open curiosity. You're researching the Callahan water rights case, aren't you? I'm Marcus Webb. I was a lawyer in this territory before I retired. Knew Thomas Callahan, actually. Good man. Hope flared in Rose's chest. You knew Beau's father? Knew the whole family. Thomas homesteaded that land legally, filed everything properly. When Jeremiah Morrison tried to challenge the boundaries in '69, I represented Thomas in court. Webb's smile was thin. We won. Decisively. The judge's ruling was very clear. Those boundaries were legally established and not subject to frivolous challenges. That's exactly what I'm looking for. The ruling from that case could prove that this current lawsuit is just harassment by a rich man who doesn't like hearing no. Webb gestured toward a door down the hall. My old office. I keep it for consulting work. Why don't we discuss this properly? In the tidy office that smelled of leather and old books, Webb laid out the situation with brutal clarity. Yes, the 1869 case set legal precedent. Yes, it should make Harrington's lawsuit a non-starter. But the judge hearing the current case was Horace Bingham, a man whose gambling debts to Richard Harrington were well known in legal circles. Even with precedent, Bingham could rule in Harrington's favor. It would be overturned on appeal, but that takes time and money. By the time the appeal goes through, Harrington could have possession of the disputed land for months, maybe years. He could run cattle on it, tear up the headwaters, make it worthless even if Bo eventually wins it back. That's not justice, Rose said, her voice tight with anger. No, it's the law. Justice and law aren't always the same thing, I'm afraid. Webb leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. But you might have another option. If you could get the case moved to a different judge, one not in Harrington's pocket, you'd have a fighting chance. How do we do that? File a motion for change of venue based on conflict of interest. Bingham's gambling debts to Harrington are a matter of public record. Any competent lawyer could argue he can't be impartial. Webb pulled out paper and began writing. I'll draft the motion for you, free of charge, in memory of Thomas Callahan, but Bo will need a lawyer to file it and argue the case. We can't afford... I know a young lawyer here in town, Daniel Ortega, just past the bar, hungry for cases that'll make his reputation. A property rights case with a clear injustice might be exactly what he's looking for. Webb finished writing and handed her the motion. Take this to him. His office is above the general store on 4th Street. Tell him Marcus Webb sent you. An hour later, Rose sat across from Daniel Ortega in an office so small she could touch both walls if she stretched her arms. Ortega was young, probably not yet 30, with dark eyes and an intensity that reminded her of Bo. He listened to her story without interrupting, his expression growing more animated as she described the case. Webb's right. This is harassment disguised as litigation. Ortega studied the motion Webb had drafted. The change of venue should be straightforward, and once we're in front of an honest judge, we have precedent on our side. I'll need to review all the documents, but from what you're telling me, this case is solid. We can't pay you much, Rose admitted. Maybe a percentage if we win, or... A percentage of what? If you lose, Harrington takes the land and there's nothing to pay me with. If you win, you keep land you already own. Ortega shook his head. I don't want a percentage. I want something better, a chance to embarrass Richard Harrington in open court and establish myself as a lawyer who fights for the little guy against corrupt power. His smile was fierce. That kind of reputation is worth more than money. So you'll take the case? I'll take the case. On one condition, I need Bo Callahan to come here and meet with me. I can't represent someone I've never talked to. He saw Rose's face fall and added quickly, just for a day. We'll go over the case, I'll explain our strategy, he signs the retainer agreement, then he can go back to his ranch and I'll handle everything else. Rose's mind raced. Leaving the ranch unattended for a day was risky, but if it meant getting legal representation... I'll bring him. 3 days from now? 3 days is perfect. Gives me time to review everything you found and prepare the change of venue motion. Ortega stood, offering his hand. You did good work here, Miss Whitmore. Most people would have given up when the clerk turned them away. I'm not most people, Rose said, shaking his hand firmly. And neither is Bo Callahan. The ride back to Copper Creek seemed shorter, fueled by hope and accomplishment. Rose pushed hard, making the 2-day journey in a day and a half, arriving at the cabin well after dark. She'd expected to find it dark, Bo asleep. Instead, every lamp was lit, and Bo was pacing the yard, his rifle in hand. He spun at the sound of hoofbeats, the rifle coming up before he recognized her. Then he was running, pulling her down from the saddle, his hands on her shoulders, her face checking for injuries. You're back. You're safe. His voice was rough with emotion. I thought, when you didn't come back this morning, I pushed hard. I found something, Bo. I found a way to fight this. Rose was babbling, exhaustion and relief making her dizzy. There was a lawyer and court records, and we have precedent, and there's this young attorney who'll take the case. You're exhausted. Come inside. Tell me everything. Bo kept his arm around her waist as he led her into the cabin, as if afraid she might disappear again. Inside, over coffee and the dinner Bo had kept warm for her, Rose laid out everything she'd discovered. The 1869 case, Marcus Webb's help, Daniel Ortega's offer to represent them. Bo listened in silence, his expression shifting from guarded hope to something approaching wonder. He'll take the case? For no upfront payment? He wants to make a name for himself fighting corrupt power. Apparently embarrassing Richard Harrington is worth more than money. Rose pulled out the motion Webb had drafted. But you have to go to Silver Ridge, meet with him, sign papers. It's just one day. Bo took the document, reading it slowly. If I leave the ranch for a day, Harrington's men might make their move. Tear up fence, run off stock. Then I'll stay here and watch for them. Rose met his eyes across the table. I can handle a rifle, Bo, and I'm not afraid of Wade Harrington. You should be. He made threats. Empty threats meant to scare us into submission. I'm done being scared. Rose reached across the table and took Bo's hand. We have a real chance here. A lawyer who believes in us, legal precedent on our side, a path to getting an honest judge. But you have to trust me. Trust that I can hold things down here for one day while you do what needs doing. Bo looked down at their joined hands, his thumb tracing over her knuckles. You came into my life 6 weeks ago with nothing but a carpetbag and broken dreams. Now you're fighting my battles, risking yourself for my land. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Why, Rose? Why do you care so much? Because I love you, Rose thought, the truth hitting her with devastating clarity. Because somewhere between the careful silence and the shared meals and the way you look at me like I'm worth something, I fell in love with you. But she couldn't say that, not now, not when everything was so uncertain. Because it's the right thing to do, she said instead. Because you gave me a chance when no one else would. Because this land is worth fighting for. She squeezed his hand. And because I believe in you, Bo Callahan. Someone should. For a long moment, they sat there in the lamplight, hands joined across the table, the weight of unspoken feelings heavy in the air. Then Bo stood, pulling her up with him. You should rest. We'll leave for Silver Ridge tomorrow. We? Rose blinked in surprise. But the ranch? The hell with the ranch. Bo's jaw was set with determination. I'm not leaving you here alone to face Harrington's men if they come. We'll board up what we can, turn the stock loose in the high pasture where they can fend for themselves for a few days. We do this together or not at all. Relief and something warmer flooded through Rose. Together, then. They spent the next morning preparing the ranch for their absence. Bo moved the cattle and horses to the remote high pasture, filled every water trough, scattered extra feed. Rose secured the cabin, hiding anything valuable, leaving the place looking humble and unremarkable. If Harrington's men came, there would be nothing worth stealing and no easy way to cause damage. They left at noon, riding double on Bo's strongest horse to make better time. Rose sat behind Bo again, her arms around his waist, and tried not to think about how right it felt to hold him this way. The landscape rolled past, red rocks giving way to pine forests, desert scrub softening into grassland. They talked more than they ever had before, Bo telling her stories about growing up on the ranch, Rose sharing memories of Boston and her life before the West. Do you miss it? Bo asked as they stopped to water the horse at a creek. The city, the civilization? Rose thought about Boston, the crowded streets, the rules and expectations, the suffocating propriety. I miss my father sometimes. He died when I was 16, left me to work for a living, but the city itself? No, I was never really free there. Always had to be what other people expected, the proper governess, the dutiful daughter, the respectable young woman. She looked out at the vast landscape surrounding them. Here, I can be myself. Even if myself is a woman who rides bareback through the hills and argues with land barons in town meetings. Bo's laugh was surprised and genuine. You did make quite an impression that night. I made enemies is what I made. You made a stand. That takes courage. Bo turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made Rose's breath catch. I'm not good with words, Rose. Never have been. But I want you to know that having you here, having you believe in me, it's changed everything. You've given me a reason to fight instead of just survive. Bo, Rose started, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. When this is over, when we've beaten Harrington and saved the land, I want you to stay. Not as hired help, not as someone I'm obligated to pay wages to. He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. Stay as my partner. As someone who has an equal stake in the ranch, in the future. Stay because you want to. Because you've chosen this life and chosen... He trailed off, the words seeming to stick in his throat. Chosen you? Rose finished softly. Is that foolish? Asking you to tie yourself to a man the whole town hates? To a life that's nothing but hard work and struggle? Rose thought about the question seriously. It was a hard life. Brutal winters, backbreaking labor, isolation from society. Beau came with complications. A past he couldn't escape. Enemies he hadn't earned. A reputation that would cling to anyone who stood beside him. By every practical measure, accepting his offer was foolish. But when she looked at Beau, really looked at him, saw the man beneath the reputation, she saw integrity, courage, a capacity for tenderness he kept carefully hidden. She saw a life that would never be easy, but would always be honest. And she saw a future where she could be fully herself, valued not for her propriety, but for her strength. "It's not foolish," she said. "And yes, I'll stay. Whatever happens with the lawsuit, wherever we end up, I'll stay." The relief that flooded Beau's face was almost painful to witness. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and Rose felt his heart hammering beneath her cheek. They stood there by the creek, wrapped in each other, and for a moment the threat of Harrington and the weight of the lawsuit faded away. There was just this: two people who'd found each other against all odds, choosing to face whatever came together. "We should keep moving," Beau said finally, his voice rough. "Want to make Silver Ridge before dark." They reached the town just as the sun was setting, found the same hotel where Rose had stayed before. This time Beau secured 2 rooms, side by side but separate. Propriety still mattered, even on the frontier. The next morning, they met Daniel Ortega in his cramped office. The young lawyer's eyes lit up when he saw the documents Rose had gathered. "This is even better than I hoped. The 1869 case, the water rights filing, the original survey. It's all here." He spread papers across his desk, building their case like a general planning a campaign. "Here's what we're going to do. First, file the motion for change of venue. I'm betting Bingham will fight it, but the evidence of conflict of interest is overwhelming. Even if he denies the motion, we'll have grounds for appeal." "How long will that take?" Beau asked. "Week, maybe 2. Then we argue the actual case. Property boundaries, water rights, the precedent from '69. Ortega looked up at them seriously. "You need to understand, even with everything in our favor, this could go wrong. Harrington has money, influence, and a willingness to bend rules. We're fighting with law and justice, which don't always win." "But they should win," Rose said fiercely. "They should," Ortega agreed. "And we're going to do everything in our power to make sure they do. But you both need to be prepared for the possibility that we lose. That Harrington gets a corrupt judge to rule in his favor, and we have to fight this on appeal for the next 2 years. Beau and Rose exchanged glances. "We're prepared," Beau said. "We fight as long as it takes." Ortega smiled. "That's what I wanted to hear. Now, let's go over every detail of this case. I need to know everything. When the original claim was filed, every boundary marker, every witness to the water rights, every interaction you've had with Harrington or his men. Everything." They spent the rest of the day in Ortega's office building their case. Rose's head spun with legal terminology and strategy, but she paid attention to every word. This was their future they were fighting for, hers and Beau's together. As evening fell and Ortega finally released them, exhausted but cautiously optimistic, they walked back to the hotel through streets lit by electric lamps. Rose marveled at the modern convenience, so different from the lamplit cabin that had become her home. "Strange to think this used to be my dream," she said, gesturing at the town around them. "Civilization, modern amenities, society. Now it feels—" She searched for the word. "Hollow?" Beau suggested. "Exactly." Rose looked up at him. "The cabin doesn't have electricity or running water or any of these conveniences, but it has something better. It has purpose. It has honesty. It has us," Beau finished. He stopped in the middle of the boardwalk, people flowing around them, and took both her hands. "Rose Whitmore, when this is all over, will you marry me? Make this partnership legal in every way that matters?" Rose's heart stuttered. She'd known this was coming, had felt it building between them, but hearing the actual words still stole her breath. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Beau pulled her close, right there on the main street of Silver Ridge, with people watching and tongues surely wagging. But neither of them cared. They'd faced down Harrington, found a lawyer willing to fight, and claimed their future together. Let people talk. The kiss was gentle, almost tentative, a promise more than a demand. When they pulled apart, Rose was crying and laughing at the same time. "We're probably crazy," she said. "Fighting lawsuits, taking on powerful enemies, building a life in the middle of nowhere." "Probably," Bo agreed. "But I'd rather be crazy with you than sensible alone." They walked back to the hotel hand in hand, plans and dreams and possibilities spinning out before them. Tomorrow they'd ride back to the ranch and wait for the legal battle to unfold. But tonight, they had this: a shared victory, a mutual commitment, and the bone-deep certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. Back at the ranch 2 days later, they found everything exactly as they'd left it. No sabotage, no stolen stock, no signs that Harrington's men had been by. It was almost anticlimactic after all their worry. "Maybe the lawsuit is all he's planning," Rose suggested as they unpacked. "Maybe he thinks he can win legally and doesn't need to resort to anything else." Bo looked skeptical. "Or maybe he's waiting to see how the legal battle plays out. If he wins in court, he gets the land clean. If he loses, then he might try something else." He set down the saddlebags and pulled Rose into his arms. "Either way, we're ready. We've got Ortega, we've got the truth on our side, and we've got each other." "When should we tell people?" Rose asked. "About the engagement?" Bo thought for a moment. "After the court case. Don't want to give Harrington any more ammunition. He could use it against us. Say, I'm not thinking clearly, that you've influenced me improperly." His jaw clenched. "Let's win first, then we'll tell the world." It was practical advice, and Rose knew he was right, but part of her wanted to shout it from the rooftops. "This good man loves me, and I love him, and we're building a life together. Take that, everyone who said we weren't worth your time." Instead, she kissed him and said, "After we win, then. But I'm holding you to that proposal, Bo Callahan." "I'm counting on it," he said, and the warmth in his eyes promised everything she'd ever wanted. The next 2 weeks passed in tense anticipation. They worked the ranch, prepared for winter, and waited for word from Ortega. Finally, a letter arrived via the weekly mail rider. Rose tore it open with shaking hands. The motion for change of venue had been granted. Judge Bingham had fought it, but the evidence of his financial ties to Harrington was too blatant to ignore. The case would be heard in front of Judge Catherine Morrison in the territorial capital, a woman known for her fairness and her refusal to be influenced by money or politics. "We have a chance," Rose breathed, reading the letter twice to make sure she understood. "A real, honest chance." Bo read over her shoulder, his arms around her waist. "Ortega says the trial's set for December 1st. That gives us 6 weeks to prepare. 6 weeks to gather evidence, line up witnesses, make sure every document is in order." Rose turned in his arms. "We can do this, Bo. I know we can. With you beside me, I believe it." He kissed her forehead. "Together, Rose. We'll face it together." And as November crept toward winter, as the first frost touched the hills and the days grew short, Rose and Bo prepared for the battle of their lives. They had truth, they had love, and they had each other. Against Harrington's money and influence, it would have to be enough. It had to be. Because the alternative, losing the land, losing their future, losing everything they'd fought for, was unthinkable. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a vengeance that caught even the old-timers by surprise. The first serious snow came in mid-November, 3 weeks before the trial, dumping 8 inches overnight and transforming the landscape into a world of white silence. Rose woke to find Bo already up, stoking the fire to drive back the cold that had crept through every crack in the cabin walls. "Animals are fine," he said before she could ask. "Got them all secured last night when I saw the clouds building. But we're going to need to break ice on the water troughs twice a day until this passes." Rose wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved to the window. The world outside looked like a painting, beautiful and harsh in equal measure. "How long will it last?" "Hard to say. Could be a day, could be a week." Bo poured coffee, his movements economical in the cold. "We've got enough supplies to wait it out. I'm more worried about the road to the capital. If it stays this bad, getting there for the trial could be difficult." The thought hadn't occurred to Rose, and it sent a spike of anxiety through her chest. They'd worked so hard, come so far. The idea that weather could derail everything felt almost cosmically unfair. "We'll make it," she said with more confidence than she felt, "even if we have to walk." Beau's smile was slight but genuine. That's my Rose. Never met a problem you wouldn't face head on. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them in the cabin with nothing to do but prepare for trial and try not to think about the future hanging in the balance. Rose went over their documents until she could recite property descriptions in her sleep. Beau practiced his testimony, his voice growing more confident with each repetition as Rose played the role of hostile attorney. On the second day, when cabin fever was beginning to set in, Beau surprised her by pulling out a worn deck of cards. "My mother taught me to play poker when I was 10, he said, shuffling with practiced ease. "Said a man should know how to read people, and cards were as good a teacher as any." They played for dried beans as currency, and Rose discovered that Beau had a terrible poker face when he was relaxed. She won 3 hands in a row before he caught on to her strategy. "You're counting cards," he accused without heat. "I'm paying attention. There's a difference." Rose laid down a full house with a triumphant smile. "That's 5 beans you owe me." "You're going to bankrupt me at this rate." But Beau was smiling as he said it, the hard lines of his face softening in the firelight. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" "My father. He said a governess who could play cards was more likely to keep her position. Wealthy families liked having someone who could entertain guests at parties." Rose gathered the cards for another deal. "Never thought I'd use the skill to fleece my future husband out of his bean fortune." The word hung in the air between them. Husband. They'd barely spoken of it since Beau's proposal in Silver Ridge, both of them superstitious about making plans before the trial was settled. But now, trapped together by the storm with nothing but time and honesty between them, the future felt suddenly, terrifyingly real. "Tell me something," Beau said quietly. "If we lose, if Harrington takes the land and we have to start over somewhere else, would you still stay?" Rose set down the cards and looked at him directly. "I fell in love with you, Beau Callahan. Not your land, not your ranch. You." She watched his eyes widen at the words she'd never spoken aloud before. "We could lose everything tomorrow, and I'd still choose you. Still want to build a life together, wherever that life takes us." Beau crossed the small space between them in 2 strides, pulling her up from her chair and into his arms. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I've loved you since you rode bareback across my property to stop Wade Harrington from cutting my fence. Maybe even before that. And I promise you, Rose, no matter what happens in that courtroom, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." They held each other as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled, 2 people creating warmth in a cold world. When they finally pulled apart, Rose saw tears on Beau's cheeks, the first she'd ever seen him shed. "We're going to win," she said fiercely. "We have to, because I want to marry you in that cabin, on that land, and I want our children to grow up in the hills where your family built something real. Harrington doesn't get to take that from us." "Our children," Beau repeated, wonder in his voice. "You've thought that far ahead?" "I've thought about everything. The life we'll build, the family we'll raise, the ranch we'll grow together." Rose cupped his face in her hands. "I've thought about 50 years from now, sitting on that porch watching our grandchildren play in the yard. So yes, Beau, we're going to win, because that future is worth fighting for." The storm broke on the 4th day, leaving the world crystalline and impossibly bright. They emerged from the cabin to find the animals healthy, the buildings intact, and the road to town buried under 2 feet of snow. Beau immediately set to work clearing a path while Rose tended the livestock, both of them driven by the knowledge that they had less than 2 weeks before the trial. A week before they were scheduled to leave for the capital, Daniel Ortega arrived at the cabin on horseback, his face grim. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Harrington's hired Jameson Burke as his attorney." Rose saw Beau's face go pale. "Who's Jameson Burke?" "The most expensive lawyer in the territory, maybe on the whole frontier." Ortega dismounted, his breath fogging in the cold air. "He's never lost a case, not once. He's brutal in court, knows every legal trick, and he has a reputation for destroying witnesses on cross-examination." "But we have the truth on our side," Rose protested. "We have precedent, documents, legal history, and Burke will twist all of it. He'll find technicalities, question the validity of old surveys, argue that territorial law has changed. He'll make the 1869 case sound like ancient history with no bearing on modern property rights. Ortega followed them inside, gratefully accepting the coffee Rose poured. I'm not trying to scare you, but you need to know what we're up against. This isn't just Harrington's money anymore. This is the best legal mind in the West working to take your land. Bo sat heavily at the table. So what do? We prepare. We make sure every document is flawless, every witness is coached, every argument is airtight. We anticipate Burke's strategies and counter them before he can deploy them. Ortega pulled papers from his saddlebag. And we pray that Judge Morrison sees through the legal gymnastics to the fundamental truth. Your land is your land, legally homesteaded and properly documented. They spent the next 3 days in intensive preparation. Ortega grilled Bo on every detail of the property, pushing him until Bo could recite boundary markers and water flow rates without hesitation. He coached Rose on how to present the historical documents, how to remain calm under aggressive cross-examination, how to speak clearly even when Burke tried to rattle her. He'll go after your relationship, Ortega warned. He'll suggest you're an opportunist who latched onto Bo for his land. He'll imply impropriety, question your morals, make you sound like a fortune hunter. Let him try. Rose's voice was steel. I came west with nothing, and I'll leave with nothing if that's what it takes. But I won't let him twist what Bo and I have into something ugly. Good. Hold on to that anger. You'll need it. Ortega turned to Bo. And he'll definitely bring up Tom Patterson. He'll paint you as a violent man with a history of taking what he wants by force. He'll try to make the jury see you as a threat to civilized society. Bo's jaw clenched. I defended a woman who was being beaten to death. I won't apologize for that. You shouldn't, but you need to be prepared for Burke to make it sound like murder. He's that good. Ortega's expression was sympathetic but firm. This trial isn't about justice or truth. It's about who can tell the most convincing story. We need ours to be ironclad. On the morning they were scheduled to leave for the capital, Rose woke before dawn to find Bo already dressed, standing at the window watching the sunrise over his land. She moved to stand beside him, taking his hand. Second thoughts? She asked quietly. Just memorizing it, the way the light hits the ridge, the shape of the hills, the color of the sky. He squeezed her hand. In case this is the last time I see it as mine. It will always be yours, Bo. No judge can change that. These hills, this cabin, they're part of you. Whatever happens in that courtroom, Harrington can't take that away. They rode out an hour later, meeting Ortega at the crossroads. The journey to the territorial capital took 2 days, and every mile felt like a step toward judgment. They passed through small towns and vast stretches of emptiness, the landscape beautiful and indifferent to human struggles. The capital was larger than Silver Ridge, with wide streets and buildings 3 stories tall. The courthouse dominated the central square, an imposing structure of red brick and white columns that spoke of power and permanence. Rose felt small looking up at it, aware that their entire future would be decided within those walls. The trial was set to begin the next morning. They spent the evening in a modest boarding house, going over their testimony one final time. Ortega had arranged for 2 witnesses to testify on Bo's behalf, Mrs. Chen, who'd filed the original water rights, and an old rancher named Samuel Tucker, who'd known Bo's father and could speak to the property boundaries. Tucker's testimony will be crucial, Ortega explained. He's respected, been in the territory for 40 years. If he says the boundaries are correct, it carries weight. What about Harrington's witnesses? Rose asked. He's bringing his surveyor who will claim the original survey was flawed, a hydrologist who will argue that the water rights were improperly allocated, and probably a dozen character witnesses to testify that Bo's a dangerous man who shouldn't be rewarded with prime grazing land. Ortega's smile was grim. Standard playbook for this kind of case. We just have to counter each point systematically. Sleep was impossible that night. Rose lay in her narrow boarding house bed, listening to the sounds of the city and thinking about everything that could go wrong. Bo was in the room next door and she could hear him moving around, equally restless. Around midnight, she heard a soft knock on her door. Can't sleep either? Bo asked when she opened it. Not even close. Rose stepped back to let him in, propriety be damned. Keep thinking about all the ways Burke could destroy us. Me too. Bo sat on the edge of her bed, looking exhausted. Keep seeing Harrington taking possession of the land, tearing up the fence, erasing every trace of my family like we never existed. Rose sat beside him, taking his hand. That won't happen. We have truth on our side. Truth didn't save Sarah Patterson's life. Truth didn't stop the town from deciding I was a killer. Beau's voice was raw. Truth doesn't always win, Rose. Then we make it win. Rose turned to face him fully. Tomorrow we walk into that courtroom and we tell our story. Not Harrington's version, not Burke's twisted narrative, ours. The truth about your father homesteading this land legally, about your mother raising you to be honest and hardworking, about how we met and fell in love and decided to build something real together. Her voice strengthened with conviction. That's our story, Beau. And it's worth telling, whether the judge rules in our favor or not. Beau pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. What did I do to deserve you? You gave a desperate woman a chance when everyone else had given up on her. You showed her that kindness still exists, even in hard places. Rose kissed him softly. We saved each other, Beau, and tomorrow we save our future. They held each other until the first light of dawn crept through the window, drawing strength from their connection. Then they dressed in their best clothes. Beau in a suit that had belonged to his father, Rose in the one good dress she'd managed to keep pristine, and walked to the courthouse together. The courtroom was already filling when they arrived. Rose saw Richard Harrington in the front row, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his expensive suit making everyone else look shabby by comparison. Wade sat beside him, his smirk firmly in place. And behind them, a whole contingent from Copper Creek, Mrs. Patterson, Deputy Crawford, half the merchants who'd turned Rose away when she first arrived. On the other side of the aisle, their supporters were pitifully few. Mrs. Chen, looking nervous but determined. Samuel Tucker, weathered and dignified. A handful of small ranchers who'd suffered similar harassment from the H-Bar and saw this case as their own fight by proxy. Daniel Ortega met them at the defense table, his young face set with determination. Remember what we practiced. Stay calm, tell the truth, don't let Burke rattle you. I'll rise for the Honorable Judge Catherine Morrison. The judge was a woman in her 50s with iron gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. She took her seat with an air of absolute authority, surveying the packed courtroom with cool assessment. This is case number 247, Harrington versus Callahan, regarding disputed property boundaries and water rights in Copper Creek territory. Are both parties ready to proceed? Jameson Burke stood, and Rose got her first good look at the man who'd never lost a case. He was tall and imposing, with the kind of commanding presence that filled a room. His voice was rich and cultured, every word precisely chosen. The plaintiff is ready, Your Honor. The defense is ready, Ortega said, and Rose heard the slight tremor he was trying to hide. Very well, Mr. Burke, your opening statement. Burke moved to address the jury. 12 men and women pulled from across the territory, faces Rose didn't recognize. That was good. It meant they had no prior loyalties to either party. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about the fundamental right to property and the proper administration of our precious water resources. The plaintiff, Mr. Richard Harrington, operates the largest and most successful ranch in the territory, a ranch that provides employment for dozens of families and contributes significantly to our regional economy. For years, Mr. Harrington has struggled with insufficient water access due to improper allocation of rights stemming from a flawed survey conducted over 30 years ago by methods we now know to be inaccurate. Burke paced as he spoke, his gestures theatrical but effective. The defendant, Mr. Beau Callahan, has steadfastly refused reasonable requests to rectify this situation. He clings to outdated documents and refuses to acknowledge that modern surveying techniques have proven his property lines to be incorrectly drawn. This stubbornness has created a crisis that affects not just the H-Bar Ranch, but the entire community of Copper Creek. Rose felt Beau tense beside her as Burke continued, painting him as an unreasonable man standing in the way of progress and prosperity. Every word was carefully chosen to make Harrington sound like the victim and Beau like the villain. Furthermore, Burke said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register, we must consider the character of the man claiming these disputed water rights. Mr. Callahan has a documented history of violence. He killed a man in the streets of Copper Creek, and while he was technically cleared of criminal charges, the fact remains that he took a life. Is this the kind of man we want controlling access to resources that an entire community depends on? Objection. Ortega was on his feet. Mr. Callahan's past has no bearing on the legal validity of his property claim. Sustained, Judge Morrison said crisply. Mr. Burke, confine your opening statement to the relevant facts of the case. Of course, Your Honor. Burke's smile suggested he'd made his point regardless. The plaintiff will demonstrate through expert testimony and documentary evidence that the defendant's property claim is based on faulty surveying and should be corrected to reflect the true boundaries. We ask that the court rule in favor of Mr. Harrington and grant him the water rights that rightfully belong to his property. Thank you. He sat down with the confidence of a man who'd already won. Rose's heart sank. Burke had managed to make their entire case sound like the selfish tantrum of a violent man unwilling to be reasonable, and he'd done it in less than 5 minutes. Ortega stood for the defense opening, and Rose could see his hands shaking slightly as he gathered his notes. Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is quite simple, despite my colleagues' attempts to complicate it. In 1867, Thomas Callahan legally homesteaded a parcel of land in what is now Copper Creek territory. He filed all proper documentation, had the land surveyed according to the laws of the time, and established water rights that have been continuously used for over 30 years. Ortega's voice grew stronger as he spoke. In 1869, those exact same property lines were challenged by a neighboring rancher. That case went to court, and the judge ruled definitively that the Callahan boundaries were legally established and valid. That ruling set legal precedent that still applies today. The plaintiff is asking you to ignore 3 decades of established property rights and overturn a legal precedent because he wants access to water that doesn't belong to him. Rose saw several jury members nodding, and hope flickered in her chest. As for the character attacks, Mr. Burke has already begun, Ortega continued, his voice sharp. Let me be clear. Bo Callahan intervened to save a woman's life. He acted in self-defense when her attacker drew a weapon. The local marshal ruled it justified. And bringing it up in this courtroom is nothing but a desperate attempt to prejudice the jury against a man whose only crime is refusing to surrender land his family legally owns. Ortega returned to the table, and Judge Morrison called for the plaintiff's first witness. Burke called his surveyor, a man named Douglas Reeves, who testified in excruciating technical detail about surveying methods, margin of error, and modern techniques that supposedly proved the original Callahan survey was flawed. Ortega's cross-examination was methodical. Mr. Reeves, you were hired by Mr. Harrington specifically to find problems with the Callahan survey, correct? I was hired to conduct an accurate survey of the disputed area. And you've been paid how much for this work? $500, with another $500 upon completion of this case. So you have a financial incentive to support Mr. Harrington's position? I have an incentive to do accurate work, Reeves said stiffly. But accurate work that contradicts your employer's position might cost you $500. Ortega didn't wait for an answer. No further questions. The pattern continued through the afternoon. Burke called witness after witness. The hydrologist arguing water allocation. Character witnesses testifying that Bo was dangerous and unstable. Even Deputy Crawford claiming that Bo had threatened violence against town officials. During each cross-examination, Ortega chipped away at credibility, exposing financial incentives and personal grudges. But Rose could see the jury's expressions growing uncertain. Burke's witnesses were polished and convincing, while Ortega's counterattacks, though solid, lacked the theatrical impact of Burke's presentation. By the time court adjourned for the day, Rose felt hollowed out with anxiety. They'd known Burke was good, but seeing him in action was terrifying. He made lies sound like truth and twisted every fact to serve his narrative. Back at the boarding house, Ortega tried to sound optimistic. We planted seeds of doubt. Tomorrow we present our case, and our evidence is stronger than theirs. But is it enough? Rose asked. Burke makes everything sound so reasonable, so logical. Even I almost started believing the survey was wrong. That's his gift. He sells a story better than anyone I've ever seen. Ortega rubbed his tired eyes. But we have something he doesn't. We have the truth, and we have you two. Bo, your testimony tomorrow is crucial. You need to show the jury who you really are, not the monster Burks painted. That night, Rose and Bo sat together in his room, too exhausted to talk, but needing the comfort of proximity. Tomorrow would be the defense's turn, their chance to tell their story. Everything depended on it. The second day of trial began with Ortega calling Samuel Tucker to the stand. The old rancher sat with ramrod-straight posture, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap. "Mr. Tucker, how long have you lived in the Copper Creek area?" Ortega asked. 42 years come spring. Arrived in 1854, before there was even a town." "And did you know Thomas Callahan?" "I did. Tom was a good man, honest as the day is long. He homesteaded his land legal and proper, followed every rule the territory set down." Tucker's voice was firm, authoritative. "I was there when he had it surveyed in '67. Watched the surveyor mark every boundary. It was done right." "And the water rights?" "The creek runs through Tom's land at the headwaters. Always has, since before any of us got here. His water rights are as solid as they come, first access by law and by nature." Burke's cross-examination was aggressive. "Mr. Tucker, you and the Callahan family were friends, weren't you?" "We were neighborly, if that's what you mean." "So you have a personal interest in seeing Mr. Callahan win this case?" "I have an interest in seeing right done," Tucker said evenly. "If that means Bo wins, then yes." "Isn't it true that you've had your own disputes with the H-Bar Ranch over grazing boundaries?" "I've had disagreements with how aggressively they expand, if that's what you're asking. Don't see what that has to do with Tom Callahan's survey being accurate." Burke smiled thinly. "It speaks to bias, Mr. Tucker. No further questions." Mrs. Chen was next, testifying about filing the original water rights documentation and confirming that everything had been done according to territorial law. Burke barely cross-examined her, apparently deciding her testimony wasn't worth fighting. Then Ortega called Bo to the stand. Rose watched her future husband walk to the witness box, his shoulders squared, his face carefully neutral. This was the moment everything hinged on, whether the jury would see Bo as Burke had painted him, or as the man Rose knew him to be. Ortega began gently, establishing the basics: Bo's age, his history on the land, his mother's death, his continued operation of the ranch. Then, carefully, he addressed the elephant in the room. "Mr. Callahan, 2 years ago you were involved in an altercation that resulted in the death of Tom Patterson. Can you tell the jury what happened?" Bo's voice was steady, factual. "I was in town buying supplies. I heard screaming and came around the corner to find Tom Patterson beating his wife in the street. She was on the ground, bleeding, begging him to stop. I tried to pull him off her. He turned on me, went for his gun. I drew faster. I didn't want to kill him, but I wasn't going to let him kill me either." "The marshal ruled it self-defense?" "He did. Said it was a clean shoot, justified under the circumstances." "Do you regret what happened?" Bo looked directly at the jury. "I regret that a man died. I regret that Sarah Patterson lost her husband, even though he was beating her. I regret that the town never forgave me for it, but I don't regret stopping him from killing his wife, and I'd do it again if faced with the same choice." Ortega nodded. "Now, regarding the current case, Mr. Harrington has made several offers to purchase your land, correct?" 3 times. Once after my father died, once after my mother passed, and once about 6 months ago." "And you refused each time. Why?" "Because that land is my family's legacy. My father built something real there, something honest. My mother's buried on that hill. It's not for sale at any price." Bo's voice roughened with emotion. "That land isn't just property to me. It's home. It's where I belong, and no amount of money can replace that." It was perfect, Rose thought, honest and heartfelt without being maudlin. She saw several jury members nodding sympathetically. Then Burke stood for cross-examination, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop. "Mr. Callahan, you say that land is your legacy, but isn't it true that you've struggled to make the ranch profitable? That you've had to hire help because you can't manage it alone?" "I hired help because my mother passed and the work is too much for one person. That's not failure, that's practical." "Speaking of the help you hired, that would be Miss Whitmore, correct?" Burke's smile was predatory. "The woman who arrived in Copper Creek destitute and desperate Looking for a man named Jonathan Mercer who'd promised to marry her? Objection! Ortega was on his feet. Miss Whitmore's personal history has no bearing on property rights. It has bearing on the defendant's state of mind and his decision-making, Burke countered smoothly. I'm exploring whether Mr. Callahan's judgment has been compromised. I'll allow it within limits, Judge Morrison said. Proceed carefully, Mr. Burke. Mr. Callahan, isn't it true that Miss Whitmore has been living in your home, unchaperoned, for the past 3 months? Beau's jaw clenched. She has her own room with a lock on the door. Everything has been proper and respectable. Proper and respectable. Burke's tone made it sound sordid. And yet you're planning to marry her, are you not? A woman you've known for mere months, who arrived here chasing a con man and latched onto you when that didn't work out? I'm planning to marry her because I love her, Beau said, his voice hard. And she agreed because she loves me, not because of my land or my money, which you've already established I don't have much of anyway. Burke switched tactics. This lawsuit has been costly for you, hasn't it? Traveling to the Capitol, hiring an attorney. I'm not paying my attorney. He took the case because he believes it's just. How convenient. So Miss Whitmore found you a lawyer who'll work for free. One might wonder what she offered in exchange. The insinuation was clear and ugly. Rose wanted to scream, to stand up and defend herself in Beau. But Ortega had warned her to stay quiet, that outbursts would only hurt their case. Miss Whitmore offered to help find legal representation because she believes in justice, Beau said, his voice shaking with controlled rage. She rode to Silver Ridge alone, searched through records for days, and found precedent that proves my case. She did all that not for money or land, but because she's a better person than you'll ever be. Mr. Callahan, Judge Morrison's voice held a warning. I'm done answering questions about Rose's character from a man who's being paid a fortune to steal my land, Beau said, looking directly at Burke. You want to question the survey, question the water rights, question my ability to run the ranch? Fine. But don't you dare suggest that the woman I love is anything less than honorable. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison banged her gavel. Order, Mr. Callahan, you will confine your answers to the questions asked. Yes, Your Honor. Beau's hands were clenched white-knuckled on the witness box rail, but his voice was calm again. My apologies. Burke's smile suggested he'd gotten exactly what he wanted. Beau losing his temper, looking volatile and unpredictable. No further questions. Ortega called Rose to the stand next, and she walked up with her heart pounding. This was it, her chance to defend not just their case, but their relationship and their future. Ortega kept it simple, having her authenticate the documents she'd found, explain the 1869 precedent, walk the jury through the property history. Then he asked the question she'd been waiting for. Miss Whitmore, Mr. Burke has suggested that your relationship with Mr. Callahan is somehow improper or opportunistic. How would you respond to that? Rose looked directly at the jury. When I arrived in Copper Creek, I had nothing. Every door in town was closed to me. Beau Callahan was the only person who offered me honest work and a chance to survive. I fell in love with him because he's a good man, kind, honest, hardworking. The kind of man who'd risk his life to save a stranger, even knowing the town would never forgive him for it. Her voice strengthened. I'm not here for his land or his money. I'm here because I choose to stand with him, whatever comes. And if we lose everything tomorrow, I'll still consider myself blessed to be his wife. She saw tears in several jury members' eyes and knew her words had landed. But Burke's cross-examination was brutal. Miss Whitmore, you say you fell in love with Mr. Callahan, but isn't it true that you'd fallen in love before? With Jonathan Mercer, the con man who lured you west with false promises? The blow hit harder than Rose expected. I thought I loved him, based on lies he told in letters. That's not the same thing. How do we know you haven't simply transferred your affections to the nearest available man? That you're not just desperate to secure your position? Because I know the difference between fantasy and reality now, between pretty words and genuine character. Rose met Burke's eyes steadily. Beau Callahan never made me promises he couldn't keep. He's never lied to me. He's shown me through his actions what kind of man he is. That's worth more than 1,000 romantic letters. Very touching, but the fact remains that you have a vested interest in Mr. Callahan keeping this land. It's going to be your home after all. Your testimony is hardly unbiased. No, it's not unbiased. I absolutely want Beau to keep his family's land, but that doesn't make what I've said untrue. Rose leaned forward slightly. The documents speak for themselves, Mr. Burke. The survey is legitimate. The water rights are properly filed. The legal precedent is clear. My feelings about Beau don't change those facts. Burke tried several more angles, but Rose held firm, refusing to be rattled. When she finally stepped down, she caught Beau's eye and saw pride there, and love, and hope. The trial continued for 2 more days. More witnesses, more arguments, more legal maneuvering. Burke brought in experts who contradicted other experts. Ortega presented document after document proving the validity of Beau's claim. The jury watched it all with increasingly glazed expressions, clearly overwhelmed by the technical complexity. Finally, on the afternoon of the 4th day, both sides rested. Judge Morrison called for closing arguments. Burke went first, weaving together all his threads into a compelling narrative about modern progress versus outdated claims, about the greater good of the community versus one man's stubborn selfishness. It was masterful, and Rose's heart sank hearing it. Then Ortega stood for his closing. He was young, inexperienced, facing the most celebrated attorney in the territory. But when he spoke, his voice rang with conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Burke wants you to believe this case is complicated. It's not. A man's family legally homesteaded land 30 years ago. Those property rights have been continuously maintained and were already validated by a court in 1869. The plaintiff wants that land because it has valuable water access. He's tried to buy it and failed. Now he's trying to take it through legal manipulation. It's that simple. Ortega walked closer to the jury box. Mr. Burke has attacked the character and motives of both Mr. Callahan and Miss Whitmore because he can't attack the facts. The facts are clear. The land is legally Beau Callahan's. The water rights are legally Beau Callahan's, and no amount of expensive lawyers or biased surveys can change that fundamental truth. He paused, letting the words sink in. This case will set a precedent. If you rule for the plaintiff, you're saying that any man with enough money can hire fancy lawyers and take land from people who can't afford to defend themselves. You're saying that legal homesteading doesn't mean anything if someone richer wants what you have. Is that the kind of territory you want to live in? The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Rose and Beau waited in a small room off the courthouse, neither of them able to eat or drink or do anything but hold each other and wait. Ortega paced, muttering to himself, reviewing every moment of the trial for mistakes. Finally, the bailiff called them back. The jury had reached a verdict. Rose's legs barely held her as they walked back into the courtroom. She gripped Beau's hand so tightly her fingers ached. This was it. The moment their future would be decided by 12 strangers who'd listened to 4 days of arguments and evidence. The jury foreman stood, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. We, the jury, find in favor of the defendant, Beau Callahan. The property boundaries as established in 1867 are valid and legally binding. The water rights as filed in 1867 belong to Mr. Callahan and cannot be transferred or revoked without his consent. The courtroom exploded in noise. Rose heard herself sobbing, felt Beau pull her into his arms. They'd won. Against all odds, against Jameson Burke and Richard Harrington's money and the weight of prejudice, they'd won. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder. Order! I'll have order in this court. When the noise finally subsided, she continued. The jury has spoken. The defendant's property claim is validated. All water rights remain with Mr. Callahan. This case is closed. She looked at Richard Harrington with something like contempt. Mr. Harrington, I suggest you accept this ruling with grace and discontinue your harassment of your neighbors. The court will not look kindly on further frivolous litigation. This court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, with winter sun breaking through the clouds, Rose and Beau stood together on the steps. Ortega was shaking hands with supporters. Samuel Tucker was telling anyone who'd listen that justice had been done, and Mrs. Chen was crying happy tears. We did it, Rose whispered. We actually did it. You did it, Beau corrected. If you hadn't gone to Silver Ridge, hadn't found those records, hadn't stood up in that town meeting, none of this would have happened. He cupped her face in his hands. You saved everything, Rose. My land, my future, my life. Our land, Rose corrected. Our future, our life. She kissed him there on the courthouse steps, not caring who saw or what they thought. Together, remember? Together, Bo agreed, for the rest of our lives. As they rode out of the Capitol the next morning, heading home to Copper Creek and the cabin in the hills, Rose looked back one last time at the courthouse where their battle had been won. They'd faced down corruption, prejudice, and the weight of money and power, and they'd won with nothing but truth, determination, and love. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because the real battle, Rose knew, was only beginning. Harrington wouldn't take this loss gracefully. Men like him never did. But whatever came next, they would face it the same way they'd faced everything else. Together, standing on land that was legally and undeniably theirs, building a future no one could take away. The celebration lasted exactly as long as it took to ride out of sight of the territorial capital. Then reality set in with the cold clarity of December air cutting through their coats. They'd won the legal battle, but Bo's instincts, honed by years of watching Harrington operate, told him the war was far from over. He'll retaliate, Bo said as they made camp their first night on the road home. Men like Harrington don't accept defeat. They just change tactics. Rose fed sticks into their small fire, watching sparks spiral up into the darkness. What can he do? The court ruled in your favor. Judge Morrison made it clear she wouldn't tolerate more harassment. Legal harassment, maybe, but there are other ways to make life difficult. Bo checked the horses one more time, a habit born of hard experience. Accidents, fires, stock mysteriously going missing or ending up dead, things that can't be traced back to him directly. Then we'll be vigilant. We'll watch for trouble and deal with it when it comes. Rose looked up at him, firelight painting her face in warm gold. We didn't survive this long just to give up because of what might happen. Bo crouched beside her, taking her hands in his. I need you to understand something. Winning that case might have made things more dangerous, not less. Harrington's been publicly humiliated. His lawyer lost for the first time in his career. That kind of blow to a man's pride. He trailed off, but Rose understood. You think he'll come after us directly. I think we need to be prepared for anything. Bo's grip tightened. And I need to know you're ready for that. Because it's not too late, Rose. You could stay in Silver Ridge or go back east, find a safer life somewhere. Stop! Rose pulled her hands free and cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. I'm not leaving. Not now. Not ever. Whatever Harrington does, we face it together. That's what you promised me, remember? Together. The relief that flooded Bo's expression was almost painful to witness. Together, he echoed, and kissed her with a desperation that spoke of all his fears and hopes tangled together. They reached Copper Creek 2 days later, arriving in mid-afternoon when the town was bustling with pre-Christmas commerce. The reaction to their presence was immediate and telling. Conversation stopped. People turned to stare. Some faces showed grudging respect. The trial had been big news, and word of their victory had spread fast. But other faces showed resentment, even hostility. Don't stop, Bo murmured as they rode down Main Street. Just keep riding. But they hadn't made it past the general store when Wade Harrington stepped into the street, blocking their path. He looked different than he had at the trial, harder, meaner, with something dangerous glittering in his eyes. Well, well, the conquering heroes return. Wade's voice dripped venom. Hope you enjoyed your little victory, Callahan, because it's going to cost you more than you can imagine. That sounds like a threat, Bo said evenly. You might want to be careful with those. The marshal's right over there. No threat. Just a fact. Wade moved closer, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. My father's a proud man. Doesn't take kindly to being embarrassed. And I'm real good at making problems disappear for him. Rose felt Bo tense, saw his hand drift toward his own weapon. Bo, don't, she said quietly. He's trying to provoke you. Don't give him the satisfaction. Wade's eyes shifted to Rose, and his smile turned ugly. The Boston whore speaks. Tell me, sweetheart, was it worth it? Trading your dignity for a piece of land that's going to end up Harrington property anyway. Bo's hand was on his gun before Rose could blink, but she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. No, that's exactly what he wants. A public confrontation where you draw first and he can claim self-defense. Listen to your woman, Callahan. Wade's grin was predatory. She's smarter than you. Pretty, too. Be a shame if something happened to her while you were out working the ranch. Accidents happen to women alone in remote places. The world seemed to slow down. Rose saw Beau's face go white, then red with rage. She saw Wade's hand tighten on his gun, ready. She saw townspeople backing away, clearing a path for violence. And she saw with terrible clarity that they were seconds away from someone dying in the street. "Mr. Harrington!" A sharp voice cut through the tension. Mrs. Chen emerged from the crowd, her small frame radiating indignation. "That's enough! You threaten violence in broad daylight and wonder why decent people want nothing to do with your family?" "This is none of your concern, old woman," Wade snarled. "It's every citizen's concern when a man threatens murder in the town square." Samuel Tucker had joined Mrs. Chen, his weathered face set with determination. "You want trouble, Wade. You'll have to go through all of us." To Rose's amazement, others stepped forward. The blacksmith, a few of the small ranchers, even the saloon owner, a woman named Nell, who Rose had never spoken to. Not many, maybe a dozen total, but enough to change the equation. Enough to make Wade reconsider whatever he'd been planning. "This isn't over," Wade said, stepping back. Not by a long shot. He turned and strode toward his horse, mounting with angry jerks of movement. Within seconds, he'd spurred the animal into a gallop, heading north toward the H-bar. The tension broke. People drifted away, conversations resuming with forced normalcy. But Mrs. Chen and Tucker remained, along with a few others. "Thank you," Beau said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "We know what would have happened," Tucker interrupted. "Same thing that happened with Tom Patterson. You'd have defended yourself, been ruled justified, and spent the rest of your life with people calling you a killer. Again." He shook his head. "Some of us are tired of watching the Harringtons run roughshod over this territory. Your victory in court gave us hope that maybe things can change." "Don't make me into some kind of hero," Beau protested. "I'm just trying to keep my land." "Sometimes that's enough," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "Sometimes one person standing up is all it takes for others to find their courage." She looked at Rose with warm eyes. "Both of you showed us it's possible to fight power with truth. Don't underestimate what that means to people who've felt powerless for a long time." As they rode up to the cabin, Rose's mind churned with the implications of what had just happened. They'd made allies today, unexpected, fragile alliances, but real nonetheless. They'd also made an enemy even more dangerous than before. Wade's threats hadn't been idle posturing. He meant every word. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it, undisturbed and waiting. Beau checked every building, every fence line, every animal, all accounted for, all safe. But the temporary reprieve felt just that, temporary. That night, as they unpacked and settled back into the rhythms of home, Rose found herself jumping at every sound. The wind rattling the shutters, the crack of shifting timber, the distant cry of a coyote. Each noise sent her heart racing, imagining Wade and his men creeping through the darkness. "We need a plan," she said as they sat by the fire after dinner. "We can't live like this, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop." Beau stared into the flames. "I've been thinking, maybe we should hire some help. A couple of ranch hands who can split the work and provide extra eyes, men who aren't afraid of the Harringtons. Can we afford that?" "Barely, but I'd rather be poor and alive than dead and property rich." Beau's jaw set. "I know some men from my time working cattle drives. Good, honest workers who need winter employment. If I can get word to them, do it," Rose said decisively. "Whatever it takes to keep us safe and the ranch running, we'll make it work." The next morning, Beau rode into town to send telegrams while Rose began preparing the small bunkhouse for potential workers. It was dusty and filled with old equipment, but structurally sound. With cleaning and some basic furnishing, it could house 2 or 3 men comfortably. She was scrubbing the floor when she heard horses approaching. 3 riders coming fast. Rose's heart leapt into her throat as she grabbed the rifle Beau had insisted she keep close. But as the riders crested the ridge, she recognized Samuel Tucker in the lead, accompanied by 2 younger men. "Miss Whitmore," Tucker called out. "Don't shoot. We're friendly." Rose lowered the rifle, relief and confusion warring in her chest. Mr. Tucker, what brings you out here? Tucker dismounted, gesturing to his companions. These are my nephews, James and Robert. Heard through town that Bo might be looking for help. Boys are hard workers, good with cattle and horses. Thought they might be interested in the position. The nephews, one dark-haired and serious, the other sandy-haired with an easy smile, tipped their hats respectfully. They looked capable, strong, and blessedly normal. Not gunfighters or troublemakers, just honest ranch hands. Bo's in town sending telegrams to some men he knows, Rose said. But I'm sure he'd be grateful for the help. The bunkhouse needs work, but it's serviceable. We can help with that too, the serious one, James, said. If you've got tools and materials, we'll have it fixed up in no time. Robert, the younger one, was already surveying the property with an appreciative eye. Fine piece of land. Can see why someone would fight to keep it. Over the next few hours, Rose found herself working alongside Tucker's nephews, cleaning and repairing the bunkhouse. They were polite, efficient, and refreshingly straightforward. James had a dry wit that reminded her of Bo. Robert whistled while he worked and told stories that made her laugh despite the tension of the past days. When Bo returned in the late afternoon, he found the bunkhouse nearly habitable and 3 unexpected visitors waiting. Tucker explained the situation while Bo listened with cautious hope. I can pay a fair wage, but it won't be much, Bo said honestly. And you need to understand what you're getting into. Working here means making an enemy of the Harringtons. They won't like seeing you side with me. We're not siding with you, James said bluntly. We're siding with what's right. Uncle Sam told us what happened in court, how the Harringtons tried to steal your land through corrupt judges and fancy lawyers. That kind of thing. He shook his head. If we don't stand against it, we're part of the problem. Besides, Robert added with a grin, the H-Bar pays terrible and treats workers like dirt. Heard enough stories to know we'd rather work for an honest man who can't afford to pay much than a rich bastard who thinks money makes him better than everyone else. Bo looked at Tucker. You sure about this? I'm sure that these boys need work and you need help. I'm sure that standing together is the only way small operations survive when big ranches try to swallow everything. Tucker's expression was serious. I'm also sure that what's coming won't be easy, but that's all the more reason to have people you can trust watching your back. The arrangement was settled with handshakes and simple terms. James and Robert would work the ranch in exchange for wages, board, and meals. They'd sleep in the bunkhouse and help with everything from fence repair to cattle management. And though it went unspoken, they'd provide extra security against whatever the Harringtons might try. That night, with the bunkhouse occupied for the first time in years and the sounds of other people's presence drifting across the yard, Rose felt something shift. They weren't alone anymore. They had allies, support, people willing to stand with them. It wasn't much. 2 young ranch hands and a handful of townspeople who'd found their courage. But it was something. December deepened into true winter. Snow fell regularly, blanketing the hills in white silence. The work was hard and constant, breaking ice on water troughs, feeding livestock, cutting firewood, maintaining fences. But with James and Robert sharing the load, it became manageable. More than that, it became almost pleasant. The young men brought laughter and energy to the ranch, their presence transforming it from a solitary outpost into something resembling a real operation. Rose found herself cooking for 4 instead of 2, and discovered she enjoyed the bustle of a full table. James appreciated her biscuits with an enthusiasm that bordered on worship. Robert always volunteered for dishes, telling outrageous stories while they cleaned up. And Bo, watching it all, seemed to relax in ways Rose hadn't seen before. The constant tension in his shoulders eased. He smiled more, even laughed occasionally at Robert's jokes. This is what the ranch was meant to be, he told Rose one night as they sat alone in the cabin, the hands having retired to the bunkhouse. When my father first built it, he imagined it growing, supporting multiple families, being part of a real community. Then he died, and my mother and I just survived, kept our heads down and endured. But this, he gestured toward the window where lamplight glowed in the bunkhouse. This feels like the beginning of something real. It is real, Rose said, moving into his arms. We're building it together. You, me, James, Robert, everyone who's chosen to stand with us. It's already more than just survival. They'd set their wedding for Christmas Day, a small ceremony with just their closest allies present. Mrs. Chen had offered to make Rose a proper dress. Samuel Tucker had agreed to stand as witness. Even Nell from the saloon had sent word that she'd provide refreshments for a modest celebration. But as Christmas approached, tension began building again. Cattle went missing, just a few at first, easy to dismiss as strays. Then a section of fence was found cut, the work clearly deliberate. James discovered fresh horse tracks near the property line that didn't match any of their animals. "Someone's watching us," James reported one evening, his young face grave. "I've spotted riders on that ridge 3 times this week. They stay just out of rifle range, but they're definitely keeping track of our movements." "Harrington's men," Bo said with certainty. "Gathering information, planning something." "Should we report it to the marshal?" Rose asked. "Crawford?" Bo's laugh was bitter. "He's in Harrington's pocket, has been for years. Reporting it would just let them know we're aware they're watching." The situation created a siege mentality. They moved in pairs now, always armed, always alert. Robert and James took turns on night watch. Rose practiced with the rifle until she could hit targets reliably at 100 yards. And Bo, his old wariness returning, checked every shadow and approached every unexpected sound with his hand on his weapon. On December 20th, 5 days before their planned wedding, everything came to a head. Bo and James had gone to check the far pasture, where more cattle had reportedly gone missing. Rose and Robert were working in the barn when they heard the thunder of approaching horses. Not a few riders, many, a dozen or more by the sound of it. Rose grabbed the rifle while Robert positioned himself in the barn doorway. Through the gap, they saw Wade Harrington leading what looked like every hand from the H-Bar Ranch, all of them armed, all of them wearing expressions of grim purpose. "Rose Whitmore," Wade called out, making no attempt to dismount. "Come on out. We need to have a conversation." Rose's hand shook on the rifle, but her voice was steady when she responded. "Anything you need to say, you can say from right where you are." "Suit yourself." Wade's smile was cruel. "We're here to make you an offer. A generous one, considering. You convince Callahan to sell the land to my father, at a fair price, we'll even go up to $2,000, and you walk away from this mess with enough money to start over somewhere civilized. Maybe go back to Boston. Live like a lady instead of a rancher's whore." Rage flooded through Rose, but she kept her voice level. "The land's not for sale. Judge Morrison made that clear in her ruling. The judge made a decision based on old documents and older prejudices. But the law can change. Politicians can be persuaded. And in the meantime, accidents can happen." Wade's tone turned darker. Terrible accidents. Fires that consume cabins with people trapped inside, cattle dying of mysterious illnesses, wells getting poisoned, men disappearing while checking fence lines. He paused to let the threats sink in. "Or you could take the money and leave. $2,000 is a lot more than you had when you arrived here. More than someone like you deserves." "Someone like me?" Rose's finger moved to the rifle trigger. "You mean someone who actually works for a living instead of stealing from their neighbors?" "I mean, a gold-digging opportunist who saw a lonely man with valuable land and latched on like a tick." Wade's horse pawed the ground, sensing his rider's agitation. "Callahan's going to get himself killed defending that land. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. You want to be a widow before you're even married? Because that's where this is heading." "Then I guess I'll be a widow," Rose said, her voice ringing with conviction she hadn't known she possessed. "Because I'd rather spend one day married to an honest man than a lifetime with blood money from thieves and cowards." Wade's face went dark red with fury. "You stupid bitch! You think you're brave standing there with that rifle? You think you can hold off 12 armed men if I give the word?" "No," Robert said quietly from beside Rose. "But she can hold off one, and I can take another. That's 2 of you dead before the rest ever get close. Want to guess which 2 go first, Wade?" For a long, terrible moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Wade's hand hovered near his gun. His men shifted in their saddles, readying for action. Rose's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst, but she kept the rifle trained on Wade's chest. Then the sound of more horses echoed across the valley. Bo and James appeared over the ridge, riding hard. But they weren't alone. Samuel Tucker rode with them, along with 5 other men from town. Small ranchers and merchants who'd apparently decided this was their fight too. The odds had shifted, not in Harrington's favor anymore. Wade looked at the approaching riders, calculation clear in his eyes. Whatever he'd planned, whether it was intimidation or outright violence, it wouldn't work with witnesses. Not this many. "This isn't over," he said, the threat automatic now, almost meaningless. "My father doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." "Neither do I," Bo said as he reined in beside the barn, his rifle already drawn. "You come onto my land with armed men, threaten my future wife, and think you can just ride away? I've got a dozen witnesses who heard you make explicit threats of arson and murder. That's enough to have you arrested." "On whose authority? Crawford's?" Wade laughed. "He won't touch me." "Maybe not Crawford, but the territorial marshal might be interested, especially after I send him a sworn statement signed by everyone here." Bo gestured to the men who'd ridden with him. "You're not as untouchable as you think, Wade. Keep pushing, and you'll find that out the hard way." For the first time, Wade looked uncertain. The territorial marshal was based in the capital, outside Harrington's sphere of influence. A formal complaint with multiple witnesses would have to be investigated, could lead to charges, might even result in Wade facing real consequences. "Fine," Wade spat. "Hide behind your witnesses, but you can't have people watching you every second of every day. And when you're alone, when it's just you in the dark and nobody around to help..." He let the threat dangle. Well, accidents happen. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following in a cloud of dust and implied violence. Rose's legs finally gave out and she sank to the ground, the rifle clattering from her shaking hands. Bo was there instantly, pulling her into his arms. "You're safe. I've got you. You're safe." "I was so scared," Rose whispered against his chest. "There were so many of them. If you hadn't come back when you did..." "But we did, and you held them off. You and Robert, you stood your ground." Bo pulled back to look at her, his eyes fierce with pride and love. "You were magnificent." Robert cleared his throat awkwardly. "I should check on the horses, make sure they're settled after all that excitement." As he walked away, the other men began dismounting, Tucker taking charge with quiet efficiency. "We'll post a rotating watch," he said. "2 men on duty at all times until this settles down. And we'll draft that statement for the territorial marshal tonight while everything's fresh. Get it filed officially." "I can't ask you all to risk yourselves like this," Bo protested. "The Harringtons will come after anyone who..." "You're not asking, we're offering." One of the other ranchers, a weathered man named Cooper, stepped forward. "My land borders yours to the east. If Harrington can steal your water rights through legal trickery, what's to stop him trying the same with me? With any of us?" He looked around at the others, who nodded agreement. "We're not doing this just for you, Callahan. We're doing it for ourselves. For the principle that a man's legal property rights actually mean something." Over the next several hours, the cabin filled with people, voices, and purpose. They drafted a detailed statement describing Wade's threats, each man signing and dating it. Tucker's nephew James rode to town to have it notarized and prepared for official filing. Robert and Cooper set up a watch schedule. Mrs. Chen appeared with food, somehow having heard about the confrontation and deciding that feeding people was the most practical way to help. As the sun set and lamps were lit, Rose found herself presiding over something she'd never expected. A gathering of allies, a community forming around shared principles and mutual defense. These weren't just helpers or employees, they were friends, neighbors, people who'd chosen to stand together against injustice. "You've built something remarkable here," Mrs. Chen said quietly, finding Rose alone for a moment in the kitchen. "Not just a ranch, a real community, people who care about each other." "I didn't do it," Rose protested. "This is all..." "You and Bo together." "Yes," Mrs. Chen smiled. "But it started with you, Rose. You were the first person in this town to stand up publicly for what was right, even knowing it would cost you. You showed the rest of us that courage was possible. Don't underestimate the power of that example." The compliment warmed Rose more than the kitchen fire. She'd come west chasing a fantasy of romance and security, and instead had found something far more valuable: purpose, community, and love built on mutual respect rather than pretty promises. That night, after everyone had finally left or settled into watch positions, Rose and Bo lay together in their bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch. Boots on gravel as Robert walked his patrol, The low murmur of voices from the bunkhouse, the normal night sounds of animals and wind. 5 days until we're married, Bo said into the darkness. Think we'll survive that long? Rose heard the attempt at humor, but also the real fear underneath. We've survived everything else. We'll survive this too. I never wanted to put you in danger. If something happened to you because of my stubbornness about keeping this land, stop. Rose rolled to face him, finding his eyes in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. I chose this. I chose you. I chose to fight for what's right. Nobody forced me, and I don't regret a single moment. She took his hand, pressing it to her heart. In 5 days, I'm going to marry you. And the day after that, we're going to keep building this ranch, this community, this life we're creating. The Harringtons don't get to take that from us. Bo kissed her then, soft and reverent, and Rose felt the fear in him ease slightly. They couldn't control what Harrington might do next, couldn't guarantee their safety or predict the future, but they could control how they responded, with courage, with integrity, with the determination to build something worth protecting. The next morning brought new snow and new complications. A rider arrived from town with a message for Bo. The territorial marshal had received their formal complaint and was sending an investigator to take statements. The process would take weeks, maybe months, but it was real movement toward actual accountability for Wade's threats. But the same rider also brought darker news. Richard Harrington had announced at a town meeting that he was offering a $1,000 reward for information leading to evidence of property fraud or document forgery related to the Callahan land claim. It was a transparent attempt to encourage someone to manufacture evidence, to find a new angle of attack when the legal route had failed. He's not giving up, James said after hearing the news. He's just changing tactics. Again. Let him try, Rose said with more confidence than she felt. Every document is legitimate. Every filing is proper. He can dig all he wants. He won't find anything because there's nothing to find. But the announcement hung over them like a dark cloud as they prepared for the wedding. Rose tried to focus on the joy of the upcoming ceremony, on the dress Mrs. Chen was sewing, on the simple celebration they'd planned. But it was hard to feel festive when armed men patrolled the property and every stranger was a potential threat. On Christmas Eve, as Rose was finishing decorations for the simple ceremony planned for the next day, she heard commotion from outside. Running to the window, she saw smoke rising from the direction of the south pasture. Not just a little smoke, thick, black columns that spoke of serious fire. Fire! Robert's shout confirmed her fear. The hay barn's burning! Everyone mobilized instantly. Bo and James ran for the barn with buckets. Robert began herding horses away from the danger. Rose grabbed more buckets and ran toward the well, her mind racing. The hay barn stored their winter feed. Losing it meant losing their ability to keep livestock through the harsh months ahead. As she ran, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Fresh hoofprints in the snow, leading away from the barn toward the property line. This wasn't an accident, this was arson. Harrington's promised accidents made real. The fight to save the barn took hours. Every able body worked frantically, hauling water, beating back flames, trying to contain the damage. The structure itself was lost, the fire too advanced by the time they discovered it. But they managed to save most of the hay by dragging it clear and kept the flames from spreading to other buildings. By the time they'd extinguished the last embers, Rose was black with soot, her hands blistered from the bucket handles, her lungs raw from smoke. Bo looked even worse, his face streaked with ash, his clothes singed in places. But they'd survived. The ranch had survived. This was deliberate, Tucker said, examining the hoofprints with Samuel Cooper and the others. Started with lantern oil, by the smell of it. Someone rode in, set the fire, and rode out, probably watching from the hills to see if it spread to the cabin. Wade, Bo said flatly. Had to be. His final warning before the wedding, or his wedding gift, Rose said bitterly, destroying our winter feed supply right before the hardest months, trying to force us to sell just to survive. They stood in the smoking ruins of the hay barn as Christmas Eve turned into Christmas morning, watching the last embers die. Tomorrow was supposed to be a day of celebration and joy. Instead, they were looking at devastation and calculating whether they had enough remaining feed to last until spring. We can share our surplus, Tucker said, breaking the grim silence. Cooper and I both have extra hay. Won't be enough to replace what you lost, but it'll get you through the winter. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. We're offering. That's what neighbors do. Tucker's voice was firm. Harrington wants to isolate you, make you feel like you're fighting alone. Best way to beat that is to prove him wrong. As dawn broke on Christmas Day, Rose stood in her ruined barn clothes, covered in soot and ash, and felt something shift inside her. They'd been attacked, yes. They'd suffered a serious blow, but they hadn't broken. And more importantly, they weren't alone. We're still getting married today, she announced, her voice carrying across the yard. Exactly as planned. The Harringtons burned our barn, but they don't get to burn our joy. They don't get to steal this day from us. Bo looked at her with something approaching awe. Rose, we can postpone, clean up, recover, reschedule. No. Rose took his soot-stained hand in hers. We get married today. We stand in front of our friends, and we promise to love each other and build a life together. And we show Harrington that he can burn our buildings, but he can't break our spirit. She looked around at the assembled group, tired, dirty, but nodding agreement. Unless you don't want to marry a woman who looks like she just crawled out of a chimney. Bo's laugh was surprised and genuine. I'd marry you covered head to toe in mud. Today. Right now. Exactly as you are. Then let's do it. Rose turned to Mrs. Chen. Is the dress ready? It's ready. And I'll help you get cleaned up and presentable. Mrs. Chen's smile was proud. Your mother would have loved you, child. That fierce heart of yours. 3 hours later, Rose stood in the main room of the cabin wearing a simple but beautiful blue dress, her hair pinned up with wildflowers that Mrs. Chen had somehow preserved through the winter. Bo stood beside her in his best suit, his hands scrubbed clean but still showing traces of smoke stains. Their small gathering of allies surrounded them, Tucker and his nephews, Cooper and the other ranchers, Mrs. Chen, Nell from the saloon, even a few townspeople who'd heard about the fire and come to show support. Tucker, pressed into service as an unofficial officiant, cleared his throat nervously. I'm not ordained or anything fancy, but I know what commitment means, and I know what these two have been through to stand here today, so I figure I can say the words that matter. He looked at Bo and Rose, his weathered face gentle. Do you, Bo Callahan, take Rose Whitmore to be your wife? To stand with her through whatever comes, good and bad, easy and hard? I do, Bo said, his voice strong and certain. And do you, Rose Whitmore, take Bo Callahan to be your husband, to build a life with him on this land, facing whatever challenges arise together? I do, Rose said, feeling tears start despite her determination to stay strong. Then by the authority of common sense in the presence of these witnesses, I declare you married. Bo, you can kiss your wife. The kiss was sweet and brief, conscious of their audience. But when they pulled apart, Rose saw everything she needed in Bo's eyes: love, gratitude, determination, and hope. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful. Mrs. Chen had brought food. Nell contributed whiskey. Someone produced a fiddle and played cheerful tunes. For a few hours, surrounded by friends in the cabin that was now truly her home, Rose forgot about burned barns and threats and danger. There was just this: a community gathered to celebrate love and resilience, to bear witness that even in hard times, joy was possible. As evening fell and guests began departing, promising to maintain the watch rotation through the night, Rose and Bo stood on their porch looking out at their land. The burned barn was a dark scar on the landscape, a reminder of what they'd lost. But it was also evidence of what they'd survived. Merry Christmas, Mrs. Callahan, Bo said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Merry Christmas, Mr. Callahan, Rose replied, leaning back against his warmth. We did it. We actually got married. Despite everything Harrington threw at us. Bo's voice held quiet triumph. We're going to make this work, Rose. The ranch, the marriage, all of it. We'll rebuild the barn, make it through the winter, and come spring. Come spring, we'll be stronger, Rose finished, because we'll have survived the worst they could do and still be standing. They stood together as stars emerged in the darkening sky, two people who'd found each other against all odds and chosen to fight for a future together. The battle wasn't over. Harrington would try again. in new and probably more vicious ways. But they'd proven something important today. They'd proven that love and community and determination could withstand even deliberate destruction. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way they'd faced everything else. Together, standing on land that was legally and morally theirs, surrounded by allies who believed that right was worth defending. It would have to be enough, because giving up was simply no longer an option. The winter that followed their wedding was the harshest anyone could remember. January brought blizzards that buried the ranch in snow so deep the cattle could barely move. February brought temperatures that froze water solid within minutes of being drawn from the well. And through it all, the Harringtons maintained their campaign of harassment with methodical cruelty. More fences were cut. A water trough was poisoned, killing 3 head of cattle before they discovered the contamination. Supplies ordered from town mysteriously went missing or arrived damaged. The pressure was constant, designed to wear them down through attrition rather than direct confrontation. But Rose and Bo had learned something crucial. They were stronger together than the Harringtons had anticipated. The community that had formed around their struggle didn't dissolve after the wedding. If anything, it intensified. Tucker's nephews stayed on through the winter, refusing better-paying work elsewhere. Cooper and the other small ranchers formed an unofficial alliance, sharing resources and information. Even some of the townspeople who'd initially shunned Bo began speaking to him civilly, recognizing that his fight was their fight too. In early March, when the worst of the winter had finally broken and the first hints of spring touched the air, everything changed. Bo had ridden into town for supplies, taking James with him for backup. Rose was working in the cabin, mending clothes and making plans for the spring planting, when she heard the sound that had haunted her nightmares for months, many horses approaching fast. She grabbed the rifle and positioned herself at the window, her heart pounding. But as the riders came into view, she realized with shock that these weren't Harrington's men. Leading the group was a tall man wearing a badge that caught the weak sunlight, the territorial marshal she'd heard about but never met. Rose stepped onto the porch, rifle lowered but ready. "Can I help you, Marshal?" The man dismounted with the ease of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. He was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen everything. "Mrs. Callahan, I'm Marshal Thomas Webb. I apologize for the unannounced visit, but I need to speak with you and your husband about the complaints filed against Wade Harrington." Rose's mind raced. The formal complaint they'd filed after Wade's threats had seemed to disappear into bureaucratic limbo. She'd assumed nothing would come of it. "My husband's in town, but I can answer questions if needed. Actually, I'd prefer to speak with both of you together. Mind if my men and I wait? We've been riding since dawn." Webb's smile was tired but genuine. "And I should mention, I've brought someone who needs to speak with you as well." From behind the marshal's men, another rider emerged. Rose's breath caught. It was Wade Harrington, but not the arrogant, threatening man she'd encountered before. This Wade looked haggard, almost scared, and his hands were bound in front of him. "What's going on?" Rose asked, thoroughly confused now. "That's what I'd like to explain once your husband returns. In the meantime, do you have coffee? It's been a cold ride." Webb's tone was conversational, but Rose sensed steel underneath. This was a man who didn't make social calls. She brought them inside, put coffee on, and sent Robert, who'd been working in the barn and come running at the commotion, to town to fetch Bo. Then she waited, maintaining careful politeness while studying the marshal and his unexpected prisoner. Bo arrived an hour later, riding hard, his face a mask of controlled alarm when he saw the marshal's horses. But Webb greeted him calmly, gesturing for him to sit. "Mr. Callahan, I'll get straight to it. I've spent the last 2 months investigating the complaints filed against Wade Harrington and, by extension, his father's business practices. What I've uncovered is considerably more serious than simple harassment." Wade shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his bound hands clenched into fists. Webb continued, pulling papers from his saddlebag. "The Harrington Ranch has been involved in systematic land fraud for at least 5 years. They've used corrupt surveyors to redraw property boundaries, bribed local officials to approve illegal transfers, and intimidated or violently removed at least a dozen small ranchers from legally held land." He laid out documents one by one, surveys, affidavits, sworn statements from witnesses who'd finally found the courage to speak. Your case wasn't unique, Mr. Callahan. It was just the first one to be successfully defended in court, and that's what broke everything open. Rose felt dizzy with the implications. How many others? 14 confirmed cases, probably more we haven't uncovered yet. Webb looked at Wade with something like disgust. When your victory in court became public knowledge, people started coming forward. Ranchers who'd been forced to sell. Merchants who'd been threatened. Even some of Harrington's own former employees, tired of being part of the corruption. He tapped the stack of papers. The weight of evidence is overwhelming. Richard Harrington is facing multiple criminal charges: fraud, conspiracy, intimidation, bribery. He'll be lucky if he doesn't spend the next decade in prison. Bo sat very still, processing this information. And Wade? Wade participated in the harassment and made credible threats of violence. He's facing his own charges. Webb's expression hardened. But he's also agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. That cooperation is why I'm here. Wade finally spoke, his voice hollow. There's going to be a flood. A big one. Bigger than anything this territory's seen in 20 years. The words seemed to make no sense. Rose looked at Bo, who'd gone pale. What are you talking about? The winter runoff, Bo said slowly, understanding dawning. The snowpack this year was massive. If it all melts at once when the weather warms, it won't just melt, it'll surge. Wade's voice shook. My father knew it was coming. The hydrologist he hired for the water rights case told him. Heavy snowpack, rapid warming, all that water hitting Copper Creek at once. It's going to flood the entire valley, could destroy half the town. Why didn't he warn anyone? Rose demanded, horror creeping up her spine. Wade's laugh was bitter. Because he owns land on the high ground, property that would become incredibly valuable if the low-lying areas, including most of the current town center, were destroyed. He was planning to buy up the ruined properties cheap and rebuild the whole town on his terms. He looked at Bo directly for the first time. Your land, Callahan, it's on high ground too. That's part of why he wanted it so badly. Not just the water rights, but the elevation. When the flood comes, your ranch will be one of the few properties left standing. The revelation hung in the air like a physical thing. Richard Harrington had been willing to let an entire town be destroyed just to consolidate his power and wealth. Had been actively working to ensure nobody was warned or prepared. When? Bo asked, his voice tight. Could be any day now. Weather's warming fast. When that snowpack starts melting in earnest. Wade trailed off. Days, maybe a week, not more. Marshal Webb stood. Which is why I rode straight here instead of filing reports in the Capitol. Callahan, your ranch is positioned to serve as a refuge when the water comes. High ground, good buildings, access to clean water above the floodline. If we can get people prepared, get them to safety before the worst hits, we might save lives. Bo was already moving, his mind clearly racing ahead. We'll need to warn the town, get people to gather supplies, move livestock to high ground. The church is on a slight rise. It might be safe. But most of the commercial district is right along the creek. I'll ride to town with the marshal, James volunteered. Start spreading the word. Help organize evacuation. I'll go with you, Robert added. We'll need every hand to move people and supplies fast. Rose found herself swept up in a whirlwind of activity. Within an hour, riders had been dispatched to warn every ranch and homestead in the territory. Bo and Tucker began organizing the ranch to serve as an emergency shelter, clearing space in the barn and bunkhouse, inventorying supplies. Rose started preparing food that could feed large numbers, stews that could stretch, bread that would keep, anything that could sustain people through a crisis. The response from town was mixed. Some people, remembering Bo's reputation and suspicious of the source of the warning, initially refused to believe the danger. But Marshal Webb's presence and authority convinced most. And when Samuel Tucker rode in confirming that the creek was already running higher and faster than normal for March, skepticism turned to fear. Over the next 2 days, Copper Creek transformed into organized chaos. People moved valuables to upper floors or high ground. Livestock were driven to elevated pastures. The most vulnerable, elderly residents, families with small children, anyone who couldn't easily evacuate on short notice, were directed toward Beau's ranch and two other properties on high ground. Rose found herself cooking for dozens, then scores of people as families arrived seeking refuge. The cabin filled. The barn became a dormitory. The bunkhouse housed overflow. And still they came, because word had spread that Beau Callahan, the man many had shunned and scorned, was opening his home to anyone who needed shelter. On the third day, the flood began. It started with a roar like distant thunder. Rose was outside hanging laundry when she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. She turned toward the valley and saw it coming, a wall of brown water surging down the creek bed, already far beyond its normal banks, swallowing everything in its path. "Everyone inside," Beau's shout carried across the yard. "Get to high ground now!" People scrambled, grabbing children and precious belongings. Rose helped herd everyone toward the main cabin and barn, her eyes fixed on the advancing water. It moved with terrifying speed, transforming the landscape as it came. Trees that had stood for decades disappeared beneath the surge. Fence lines vanished. The land she'd come to know so well became an alien seascape of churning brown water. The flood reached the base of their hill and stopped, held back by elevation and geology. But in the valley below, Copper Creek was being rewritten. Rose watched in horror as buildings she recognized from town were lifted off their foundations and carried away. The general store where she'd first been rejected, Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, the saloon. One by one, they succumbed to the water's overwhelming force. "The church," someone whispered beside her. Rose turned to see Mrs. Chen, tears streaming down her weathered face as the church, the tallest building in town, the center of community life, tilted, groaned, and collapsed into the flood. Not everyone had made it to safety. Despite the warnings, some had stayed in town, either disbelieving the danger or unable to leave their homes. Rose watched rescue attempts with her heart in her throat as Beau and other men took ropes and horses to try to reach people trapped by the rising water. They saved some, a family clinging to their roof, an elderly man stranded in a tree, children separated from their parents in the chaos. But they couldn't save everyone. The town's marshal, Deputy Crawford, who'd remained in town to coordinate evacuation, was swept away trying to help a shopkeeper secure his goods. They found his body 3 days later, miles downstream. Several others died too, people who'd waited too long, who'd underestimated the water's power, who'd simply been unlucky. Through it all, Beau was everywhere at once, organizing rescue efforts, distributing supplies, comforting the traumatized and bereaved. The man the town had called a killer worked tirelessly to save lives, risking his own repeatedly without hesitation. Rose watched him dive into the frigid floodwater to grab a child who'd been swept off a roof. Watched him hold a rope while 3 other men crossed the torrent to reach stranded families. Watched him work until he could barely stand, then rest for an hour and do it all again. And she understood, perhaps for the first time, the depth of his character. This wasn't about redemption or proving anything. This was simply who Beau was, a man who would do what needed doing, regardless of cost or recognition. The worst of the flooding lasted 4 days. When the water finally began to recede, it revealed devastation beyond anything Rose had imagined. The town of Copper Creek was simply gone. A few buildings on high ground remained intact, but the commercial heart of the settlement had been swept away entirely. Homes, businesses, lives, all erased by water and mud. But the people had survived. Not all, but most. And they'd survived largely because Beau Callahan had opened his land to refugees and led rescue efforts that saved dozens of lives. As the full scope of the disaster became clear, something remarkable happened. People who'd scorned Beau for years began seeking him out, not with apologies, but with gratitude. Mrs. Patterson, who'd lost her boarding house, approached him quietly one evening. "My son," she said without preamble. "Tom. He was a violent drunk, and you stopped him from killing Sarah. I know that. I've always known it." Her voice cracked. "I blamed you anyway because it was easier than admitting what my boy had become. Easier than facing my own failure as a mother." She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "You saved my daughter-in-law's life, and I repaid you with hatred. And then, when everything fell apart, you saved mine. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway." Beau's response was characteristically simple. You have it, Mrs. Patterson. Fresh start for all of us. Similar conversations played out over the following days. People confronting their own prejudices, acknowledging what Beau had done, beginning to see him as the man Rose had always known him to be. It wasn't universal. Some remained stubbornly opposed, clinging to old grudges. But enough changed that the atmosphere shifted palpably. A week after the flood, Marshal Webb returned with news. Richard Harrington had been arrested and charged with criminal conspiracy, fraud, and reckless endangerment. The evidence of his knowledge about the coming flood and his deliberate failure to warn anyone had turned public opinion decisively against him. Even his wealth and influence couldn't save him from the magnitude of his crimes. He'll stand trial in the Capitol, Webb explained. And based on what we've uncovered, he'll be convicted. His assets are being seized to compensate his victims, the ranchers he defrauded, the people who lost property in the flood he knew was coming but didn't warn about. The H-Bar Ranch will be broken up and sold to pay restitution. Wade, who'd been housed separately under guard, looked like a shell of his former self. His cooperation had earned him a reduced sentence, but he'd still face years in prison. And the Harrington name, once synonymous with power in the territory, was now associated with corruption and criminal negligence. "What happens to the town?" Rose asked. "To Copper Creek?" "That's up to the people who lived there." Webb looked around at the refugee camp that had taken over the Callahan Ranch. "They need to decide whether to rebuild on the old site or relocate to higher ground. Either way, it'll take years and resources most don't have." Beau had been quiet through most of this conversation, but now he spoke up. "What if we rebuilt it here? Not on our land specifically, but in this area. There's open land on this ridge that could support a town. Higher elevation, safer from flooding, good access to water and timber." He looked at Rose, who nodded encouragement. "We could survey plots, establish a new town center. People could file new homestead claims on available land. Start over, but start smart." The idea caught fire. Within days, people were discussing layouts and locations. Tucker and Cooper volunteered to help with surveying. Mrs. Chen started organizing committees to plan a new commercial district. Even Nell, the saloon owner, began making plans for a new establishment, joking that the town would need somewhere to drink and forget their troubles. Rose found herself at the center of the planning, her organizational skills and education making her invaluable. She helped draft proposals, coordinate resources, mediate disputes about lot placement and business licenses. The woman who'd arrived 6 months ago with nothing but a carpet bag had become an integral part of the community's rebirth. 2 months after the flood, on a warm May morning, the new town of Hope Ridge, named for both its geographical location and the fresh start it represented, was officially founded. The first building completed was a modest school where children could resume their education. The second was a community hall where town meetings could be held and decisions made democratically. Beau donated 10 acres of his land for public use, the town square, civic buildings, a small park. Other landowners did the same, creating a patchwork of private and public spaces that formed the foundation of a real community. And at the center of it all, on land that had once been considered cursed because of who owned it, life began to flourish. Rose stood in the doorway of the new general store, run by the same merchant who'd once refused to hire her, and marveled at the transformation. Where 6 months ago there had been nothing but grass and sky, now there were homes, businesses, people building lives together. Quite a change, isn't it? Mrs. Chen appeared beside her, her arms full of fabric for the clothing shop she was opening. From outcast to founder, from rejected to respected. "I'm not sure I'm comfortable being respected," Rose admitted. "All I did was stand up for what was right." "All you did?" Mrs. Chen repeated with a knowing smile. "My dear, you changed the course of this entire territory. You stood with Beau when everyone else condemned him. You organized the legal defense that exposed Harrington's corruption. You helped coordinate the flood response that saved lives. And now you're helping build a new town based on fairness and community rather than power and wealth. All you did is reshape our future." Rose felt her eyes prick with tears. "I just wanted a home, a place to belong. And you found it. More importantly, you created it. Not just for yourself, but for all of us." Mrs. Chen squeezed her hand. "Your father would have been proud of the woman you've become." That evening, Rose and Beau sat on the porch of their cabin, no longer isolated, but now on the edge of a growing town. The sounds of construction and conversation drifted up from the new settlement. Children played in the yards of newly built homes. Smoke rose from chimneys where families cooked dinner. "Do you ever regret it?" Beau asked quietly. "If you just left that day when Wade made his threats, gone back east like he suggested, you could have had an easier life." Rose thought about the question seriously. An easier life, yes. Safe, predictable, comfortable in its own way, but also empty, meaningless. "I regret nothing," she said finally. "Every hardship, every danger, every moment of fear, it was all worth it to be here now. To be your wife, to be part of this." She gestured toward the town below. "We built something real, Beau, something that matters." "You built it," Beau corrected gently. "I was just trying to hold on to my land. You're the one who saw the bigger picture, who understood that it wasn't just about one ranch or one family, but about standing up for principles that would shape everyone's future." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the months since the flood, Beau had changed too. The haunted wariness that had defined him when Rose first arrived had eased. He smiled more readily, laughed at jokes, engaged with neighbors like a normal member of a community rather than an exile tolerated at the edges. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Marshall Webb rode up with a young woman Rose didn't recognize, slim, with dark hair and eyes that held old pain. "Mr. and Mrs. Callahan," Webb said, dismounting. "I have someone I thought you should meet. This is Sarah Patterson Morrison. She's recently remarried and returned to the territory." Rose's breath caught. Sarah Patterson, the woman Beau had saved, whose husband he'd killed. The reason the town had turned against him. She looked different than Rose had imagined. Stronger, with a quiet dignity that spoke of survival. Sarah approached slowly, her eyes fixed on Beau. "Mr. Callahan, I heard what you did during the flood, how you opened your home, saved lives, helped rebuild." Her voice was soft but steady. "I wanted to thank you, not just for that, but for what you did 2 years ago. You saved my life when Tom—" She faltered, then continued, "When Tom would have killed me. The town blamed you, but I never did. I've been carrying that guilt for years, knowing you paid a price for my rescue." "You don't owe me thanks or guilt," Beau said gently. "I did what anyone should do, what I hope someone would do for anyone in that situation. But everyone didn't do it. You did, at great cost to yourself." Sarah's eyes were wet now. "I ran away because I couldn't bear the weight of what happened, couldn't face the town's judgment. But I heard about the trial, about Miss Whitmore standing up for you, about how you fought back against Harrington. And I realized I'd been a coward. So I came back to say what I should have said 2 years ago. Thank you. Thank you for my life. Thank you for showing me that standing up to violence was possible." She looked at Rose. "And thank you, Mrs. Callahan, for standing with him when I couldn't." Rose found herself embracing this stranger who represented so much of their shared pain. "You survived. That took its own kind of courage. And you came back. That takes even more." Sarah stayed for dinner, telling them about her new life, her new husband, her plans to settle in Hope Ridge and start fresh. And as they talked, Rose felt another piece of the past fall into place. The woman whose suffering had branded Beau a killer in the town's eyes had returned to validate his actions, to bear witness to the truth. As summer deepened into the season of growth and plenty, Hope Ridge continued to take shape. A proper church was built, and when they held the dedication ceremony, they invited everyone, including those who'd opposed Beau, who'd doubted, who'd maintained their prejudices despite everything. Some came and some didn't, but the invitation itself represented something important: forgiveness, openness, the possibility of change. Rose discovered she was pregnant in July, the knowledge filling her with joy and terror in equal measure. She told Beau one evening as they walked through their now productive garden, watching vegetables grow in soil they'd cultivated together. "A baby," Beau breathed, his hands moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you ready?" Rose asked, suddenly nervous. For everything that means? Bo pulled her close, his embrace gentle but firm. I'm ready for anything, as long as you're with me. And our child? His voice broke slightly with emotion. Our child will grow up in a community built on justice and truth. We'll never know what it's like to be judged for their parents' past. We'll have the fresh start we've worked so hard to create. The baby arrived the following March, exactly a year after the flood that had changed everything. A girl with Bo's dark hair and Rose's determined expression. They named her Hope, after the town they'd helped build and the principle that had sustained them through their darkest days. The town of Hope Ridge thrived. Within 2 years, it had surpassed the old Copper Creek in size and prosperity. New families arrived, drawn by tales of a community founded on fairness and mutual support. Businesses flourished. Children attended the school where Rose sometimes taught, sharing her love of learning and her belief in standing up for what was right. Richard Harrington died in prison 18 months into his sentence. His empire dismantled, his name synonymous with corruption. Wade served his time and left the territory upon release, seeking a fresh start far from the scene of his family's downfall. The H-Bar Ranch was divided among the families that had been defrauded, becoming a patchwork of smaller operations that worked cooperatively rather than competitively. 5 years after the flood, Rose stood on the same porch where she'd once listened to Bo's dire warnings about Harrington's retaliation and marveled at how wrong those predictions had been. Not because Harrington hadn't tried to destroy them, he had, in every way he could imagine, but because in trying to break them, he'd inadvertently created the conditions for something better to grow. Hope Ridge had become a model community, referenced in territorial newspapers as an example of how cooperation and integrity could build something lasting. People traveled from across the West to see how a town founded on principles rather than profit could thrive. And at the center of it all, quiet and unassuming, were Bo and Rose Callahan, the rancher and his wife who'd simply refused to surrender to injustice. "Mama! Papa!" Hope's voice called from the yard, where she was playing with the Tucker boys and a handful of other children. "Come see what we built!" Rose and Bo walked down to admire the fort the children had constructed from scrap lumber, a ramshackle but sturdy creation that showed real creativity and cooperation. As they praised the work, Rose caught Bo's eye and saw there the same wonder she felt. This life they were living, this community they'd helped create, this future spreading out before them, it was so much more than either had dared imagine in those desperate early days. That night, after Hope was asleep and the house quiet, Rose and Bo lay together in their bed and talked about the journey that had brought them here. From her desperate arrival on the stagecoach to his wary offer of employment. From the town meeting confrontation to the brutal trial. From the Christmas fire to the devastating flood. All of it had been necessary, had shaped them into the people capable of building what they'd built. "If you could go back," Bo asked sleepily, "knowing everything that would happen, all the danger, all the struggle, would you still get on that stagecoach? Still come west chasing Mercer's lies?" Rose didn't hesitate. "Every single time, because those lies led me to the truth, to you, to this life, to hope and the town and everything we've become." She kissed him softly. "The hardship was real, but so is the joy. And I'd walk through fire 1,000 times to end up exactly here." In the darkness, Bo's arms tightened around her, his silent agreement more eloquent than words. Outside, the town they'd helped build slept peacefully under a blanket of stars. Children dreamed safe in their beds. Families rested secure in homes built on honest land claims. And on the hill above it all, in the cabin where everything had begun, 2 people held each other and counted their blessings, not in gold or land or power, but in love, community, and the knowledge that they'd fought for something worth having. The flood that had threatened to destroy everything had instead washed away the old order, making room for something better to grow. And from the devastation had risen Hope Ridge, a town built not on who had the most money or the biggest ranch, but on the simple radical notion that justice and integrity mattered more than power. It wasn't a perfect place. Problems still arose, people still disagreed. Life was still hard in the way frontier life always was. But it was honest, it was fair, and it was theirs, built by their hands, sustained by their values, growing toward a future they could believe in. As dawn broke over Hope Ridge, painting the new town in shades of gold and promise, Rose woke to the sound of her daughter's laughter and her husband's gentle voice reading a story. She lay still for a moment, drinking in the ordinary miracle of this life she'd built from nothing but determination and hope. She'd come west seeking a fantasy of romance and security. Instead, she'd found something infinitely more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, a community founded on shared principles, and a legacy that would outlive them both. The woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a broken dream had become the cornerstone of something lasting. And when Hope grew old enough to ask about how the town got its name, Rose would tell her the truth. That hope wasn't just a feeling or a wish. It was a choice, a decision to keep fighting even when the odds seemed impossible, a commitment to building something better even when everything seemed lost, a refusal to surrender to fear or injustice or the weight of other people's judgments. Hope was what had sustained them through their darkest days. Hope was what they'd offered to a community in crisis. And hope was what they'd woven into the very foundation of the town that bore its name. The story of Rose and Bo Callahan became legend in the territory. The abandoned woman and the outcast rancher who'd fought corrupt power and won, who'd survived natural disaster to build something better, who'd transformed personal struggle into community triumph. But to Rose herself, it was simpler than that. It was the story of two broken people who'd found each other, stood together, and refused to give up. And in refusing to give up, they discovered that love and integrity and stubborn determination could reshape the world. It was enough. It was everything. And as Rose stepped out onto the porch to greet the new day, her daughter's hand in hers and her husband's arm around her waist, she knew with absolute certainty that every hardship had been worth it. Every fear overcome, every battle won, every moment of doubt pushed through, all of it had led to this, to home, to family, to a community built on hope, to a future worth fighting for. And she wouldn't change a single moment of the journey that had brought her here.